And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. It's great to be here with everyone. It's a huge crowd already. Of course, as usual, I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And so many things going on since our last broadcast, of course, and everybody's knee deep in all of this coronavirus craziness that's been going on. One of the things that we can say is that even in the changeover from last week to this week, we're looking at a different situation again. And this is how it works. It starts off in one direction, looks like it might be getting better, and then they turn it around and it's worse, and then it gets a little worse, and then it seems like they're going to say something better, and boom, it gets worse. So they've been playing this pattern out, and I would say President Trump has been kind of like a ping pong ball with all this, and I think it's thrown him off his game. And interestingly enough, I thought he was on his best when he was talking about reopening the country for Easter. April 12th, it showed he had the authority over this situation and was starting to open things up in terms of sectors. But he got some other information, and we've been playing with the middle managers ever since, playing along with governors and county managers and mayors and all of that, and trying to support all these healthcare workers taking this on. However, in the background, creeping onto this thing from the very beginning was a totally different operation. And this operation, which we've been discussing in this program, is continuity of government. And it is about that exercise going live. And we really need to get into the deeper aspects tonight of what they've been flaunting on the continuity of government side. And we're also going to be taking your questions in the second part of the program. And this one is X-84. Now, X-Series 84, it is blackouts and bunkers. This is the deep state COG plans for using this crisis and for initiating a whole different era of emergency powers. So when you ask your questions anytime, just ask them in caps, and we will take them in the second part of the program. As Miss Olivia puts them together. How's it going out there?
Tons of people, and I'm just waiting for the questions.
It's good. I see a lot of familiar faces out there. We're going to go in a very, very interesting direction tonight, and we'll trek along with you all the way. Now, one of the things I want to point out right off the bat is COG is a continuity of government. It is something that's on the record books, largely put there by Professor Peter Dale Scott. It had come out in slips. The Miami Herald published something about it in 1987. And there were rumors that this was happening during the Reagan administration, about the Reagan administration looking to survive a nuclear war and setting up this incredible, vast underground network. Now, these networks had existed during the time of Eisenhower for the same purpose, but they got radically renovated, shall we say, during the period of the Reagan administration, as Reagan's administration had some very heavy-handed figures on the CIA side, and they thought of different ways to manipulate Reagan. Of course, former CIA Director George H.W. Bush was his vice president. And George H.W. Bush figures very prominently in the setup of this new version of COG, which Professor Scott says continuity of government is not actually a good name for it, even though that's the official term. He calls it change of government because it throws the Constitution out and initiates basically a fascist martial law takeover. Now, one of the reasons that, this was set up in the first place was because of the very real danger of a decapitation strike on the government and an entire, group there of different military officers needing leadership to do a counterattack. And they needed to put a structural government in place. And oddly enough, it was, in fact, Truman who originally realized this after the war. And then, they thought there was an incoming nuclear attack during his presidency, and he actually wouldn't even go into the bunker. That's the kind of interesting character he was. But with Eisenhower, it became much more extensive. So it was almost like a secondary government living and breathing and developing down there. And more it came out of the purview of public announcements and everything was classified, but then it went beyond classified, and it went into this total black program, and eventually became a competing government. And we will find in Professor Scott's work, which we cite very often in this program, he's the author of American Deep State and a number of other classic titles. But one of the things Professor Scott pointed out is that every time we had a deep event, that is something that changed the country, and always had questions around it, like the JFK assassination, like Watergate, like Iran-Contra, the October surprise, 9/11, the 2008 crash. There's always this other element in there. And those deep events always seem to include COG people. This is something that he came across, and that brings everything I'm going to present tonight around for us to really understand who is operating right now in the middle of this corona crisis, beyond just the middle managers that are just trying to do their job and taking the information that they've been handed. Now, it's been proven, so many people on the alternative side and so many doctors and stuff have come forward to really rebut the kind of hysteria that's been injected around the COVID-19 virus. And that's not to minimize any major health issues that we're having as a result, but it's to get it in perspective, because it's very important to have the perspective, because it's being used right now as a crowbar to try to take away the rights of citizens in America, in the UK, and in France, all across Europe, and so many other places. Now, it doesn't mean they're not dealing with something that's happening, but the overinterpretation and the incredible hype around it, the kind of black plague, chasing everyone over a cliff, stopping all action, this is the aspect where they get to piggyback this other thing. And particularly speaking of continuity of government in America, but I'm going to show you tonight that there are many countries that are executing their continuity of government plans. This is not American exclusive at all. And we've seen with things, like the Queen heading for the hills and Israel opening their doomsday bunker, that this is a worldwide exercise and operation. But where we can get a good glimpse of it is in America, because we have those researchers who've gone deep, and in the course of those deep events, a lot of study and a lot of research has gone in. Let's take a look at something that Professor Scott had to say about this aspect, which I think is crucial. This is from the American Deep State, Wall Street, Big Oil, and the Attack on U.S. Democracy. Professor Scott is a former Canadian diplomat, actually, and he's a UC Berkeley professor, and he has put out a number of books since the late 1960s, dealing with everything from CIA drug running to the JFK assassination to deep politics, and in fact coined the term the deep state. And its popular usage, when I was doing interviews with him, and we've done one every year, say 2014 through 2018. And we talked recently about setting up a new one. And it's kind of fascinating to me, because when I was doing those interviews and putting deep state in the title, it meant almost nothing, except for people who understood Professor Scott's work. But interestingly enough, during the 2016 election, because Roger Stone was around, was familiar with this, he used the term for the opposition that was against Trump. And so it caught on that way in this kind of limited fashion. And then when the cat was out of the bag, the popular mainstream media tried to go after it and really kind of redefine the term. But as it turns out, it's a much larger picture, the deep state, than just something that you hear in mainstream. On the alternative side, we also have kind of a flimsy version of deep state floating around out there, and so we really need to get that definition straight if we're going to understand the value and the purpose of a term like that. So I'm going to read this real quick, and then we're going to figure out how these deep events have shaped the current crisis that we're in. And you're going to see a lot of the players come up, which is going to make this picture a lot more complete. Okay, so Professor Scott says, quote, since I first advanced the hypothesis that the continuity of government communications network was involved in all of our structural deep events, I have found further corroboration for it. For example, John Dean, perhaps the central Watergate figure, had participated in continuity of government activities when serving as the Associate Deputy Attorney General. And an Army Reserve officer, Norman Katz, revealed in October 2013 that because of his work in COG communications, he was summoned to Washington in November 1963 in connection with President Kennedy's trip to Dallas. Now, I want to mention here also that a number of figures connected with COG were involved in assassinations. For example, Winston Lawson is another one of these Secret Service agents who helped set up the trip for President Kennedy. Winston Lawson also used the emergency Doomsday Network communications network when he was setting up the trip and on the day of the assassination. No one knows why he used it, because it wasn't protocol for the Secret Service to use that emergency Doomsday Network. What happens with that network and why it was pulled into things like when we were selling arms to Iran to fund the Contras, and the Contras were drug running money for the CIA and all that, is fundamentally it can't be traced. So the NSA can't go and say, we've got a warrant, we want to go into COG communications. It has such a level of untouchableness that you can't get in there if you're any agency. So the FBI had a great frustration with it. It's only come up a few times in open session. It's come up during the Iran-Contra hearings because Oliver North was a major participant. And Oliver North, when he was questioned, was about to answer something in relation to continuity of government and was stopped by the senator from Hawaii, Daniel Inouye, who said, you can't talk about it. It literally is that secret. It can't even be mentioned. Now later, in this program, we've covered things like the secret space program and all of the secrecy surrounding the space development. And I've theorized, and this is not something that Professor Scott has put out there. Professor Scott speaks about the deep state and COG in its actual terms that he's been able to prove. But what I've surmised is that they took the same planning, they took the same secrecy planning that is so black, and they just whoosh, like that. So that's how you get a secret space program, because all these things that happen in space go under the same continuity of government rules, and voila, nobody can trace it. There's all this money that's disappearing. As Catherine Austin Fitz has pointed out, right now we have people jumping up and down and talking about, will a mask help you walking around? When in fact, they should be talking about, where's the $65,000 that's been taken from every citizen along the way?
I would like that back. Thank you very much.
I think it would help a lot
right now.
Instead they're handing out this $1,200 dividend. And it was funny because I was going through these numbers, and one of the things they're doing with those $1,200 checks is they're sending them out on a graduated basis. So if you make $10,000 a year, you're already in real trouble. So they're going to send that to you in late April. But if you make $20,000, you're still in deep trouble. You're going to get your check May, you're going into May. And then if you make $30,000, well, you get that in more like June. And then it progressively goes along so that their last round of checks actually go out in September. Can you imagine waiting around for $1,200? And it's a tough thing. It's a tough thing. They really should have allotted more in that bailout for the average citizens who they are forcing not to work. And that is an anti-constitutional act. Now, you can imagine that they're using things that are in continuity of government that were set up for a natural disaster, that is a massive earthquake, for example, or something like 3 Mile Island, if you can go back to a major nuclear accident, Chernobyl style. And you could also look at it and say, if a nuke got free, if somebody lost a nuke or somebody bombed us or let a nuke off, these are the types of rules that are being put in place. So you have to ask yourself, beyond the basic safety of the suggestions, really, how long can you shut down the livelihood of an entire country, not to mention the world? We're dealing with 330 million citizens. It does not wash, but I'll tell you why it doesn't really wash in terms of the politics of it. Because you have a situation now where they're saying, well, if you don't, they're getting more and more draconian and saying if you don't obey these rules, you are going to land in jail or have a $5,000 fine, which defeats the whole purpose of giving you money in the first place. And the idea of putting somebody in jail, well, what we've seen are massive releases of prisoners, dangerous prisoners, sexual predators, and,
child molesters.
Yes. Now think about that. When do you get into a situation where you're trying to work with the public welfare and say, we're trying to save you all so you don't spread this, whatever it is they're calling it at this point, this virus, but then they're going to release a bunch of criminals out in your neighborhoods while you don't have the ability to run your normal errands the way you normally would, or go to work, or any of those things? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't add up. And if you look at these people over and over again, they have not had the public's best interest in mind. So we have to think of them differently, and while still respecting the kind of middle management proclamations and trying to help those healthcare workers and people get their job done, we still have to think beyond the situation for them, actually, and for ourselves. But as citizens, there is a limit to what we can put up with. And when you see people like Bill Gates, who is absolutely taking this role upon himself of kind of lecturing the country that they need to shut down and we all need to shut down. Really, what I want is a hashtag to catch on for Bill Gates, which is STFU Gates. Hashtag STFU Gates. That's the one that we need, because Gates is not a doctor. He is not a medical professional at all. He didn't even finish college. And he was an incredibly unscrupulous CEO, and he was one of the worst. As a matter of fact, the government had to take away his monopoly of Microsoft because of the incredible dirty tricks that he pulled. This is the real story of Bill Gates. When you work in the tech field, as I was a tech editor for 10 years, you understand Bill Gates inside and out. Just watch the Pirates of Silicon Valley. You get a hint of it. And, it's kind of funny on a business sense. You think, well, this guy hijacked all this stuff and ha, ha, ha. You think about that with Trump, too. These guys go in there and they play dirty and whatever, they know how to get things done and get to the top and all that. And it's part of their story. But I'm not going to trust them with the public health. That's a totally different thing. And the idea of Gates coming off as Martin Luther Gates, with his vaccine on a mountaintop is ridiculous. And, recently it's come to my attention from a firsthand source that Trump did ask RFK Jr. to come on board and look at the vaccine issue in 2017. Now, this is very interesting because I always wondered what happened with that. And later we found out through Gates basically talking himself and saying, Trump asked me about that and said Robert F. Kennedy Jr. said vaccines are dangerous for this reason, that reason, and this reason, need to be looked at in a much deeper way. And Gates said, no, no, no.
Bad idea.
So we have to look at these things realistically. We can't take the hype and we can't take the PR. If we live on hype and PR, you end up in Nazi Germany. It's as simple as that. We've gone through that. We've seen that movie. We've seen how it ends, and it's not very pretty. And so in America, we don't do that. We face the danger. We're known for it. And other countries are known for it too. So this idea of just surrendering our rights to a small group making decisions and changing their projections all over the place, going from, oh, this thing has a 4 death rate, I guarantee you're going down, to saying, no, actually it has a 1. Okay, this is Fauci now, Trump's guy on it. And he went from 4 to 1. Now he's gone below 1. So, these numbers are getting a little more, by the time this is over, it's going to be like how much overreach was involved and how many rights did we give up? And the question is how much of the exercise of COG is initially piggybacking on the back of this whole thing, but then are they going to take that exercise live? Or is Trump going to wake up and find himself replaced by Terrence O'Shaughnessy? We pointed out on this program, and we're going to get into him too. Everyone, you're watching X-84. This is really going deep into bunkers and blackouts, and we're going to get into that section. We have to understand the COG deep state connection, what their plans are. In order to get a good grip on this, I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com to sign up for our newsletter. We actually have looked at all kinds of shutdowns around social media. We've seen our own stuff shadow banned, and I don't like to really complain about that stuff, but I think the possibility exists that they could just zap a channel like mine. And because of that, I want you to go there so we have that direct pipeline, because we'll always be broadcasting this material, so it's better if you can find it. And the best way to find it is just go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter, and that way we have that direct pipeline. And we don't market anything through that newsletter. You get it once
one newsletter a week for the show.
Yeah, unless we do 2 shows. And you find the show on Friday nights here. So it's a better way to go in general. Now, before I jump in,
can I ask a question?
Yes.
All right. I love a man who gets straight to the point.
Yes.
All right. Marco Zerpa, DJ. The psychopaths are taking our country over. Is that the case? It kind of feels like it.
It's been that case for a long, long time. I think what's happening now is that they are, they're pulling out the stops to, they're sort of taking off the mask, and that's a very dangerous unveiling. So we need to be ready for it, because remember, they have shock doctrine inside the military and inside intelligence units. So shock doctrine is to shock you so much that you're frozen and then they can act. But you're not going to be able to throw out the entire Constitution that has been built, and people have died in wars, and families and heritages have gone back for so many years with this. You're not going to be able to throw that out. We're coming up to 250 years of the American Revolution in 2026. So if you think you're going to throw
but the founding fathers are a bunch of white racists to be ashamed of.
They've been working on that.
They have been working hard.
Can you imagine what Thomas Jefferson would say if they told you, hey, you're going to stay home for 18 months? The muskets would be flying. But this is the thing. They've come out with their operation, and they've attached it in such a way to a health crisis that they've tried to confuse our responses. Or they've taken a health crisis and they've thrown their weird thing on top of it. What they want to come out of it with, and people like Gates are just coming out and saying it, is they want you to have a certificate that says, here's my corona history, here's my vaccine history, can I please travel interstate? So
please.
Those are
pretty please.
Those are Nazi tactics. And it is a control tactic, and you have to remember those people are all about centralization and harvesting. That's just how they look at you and I. They look at us as commodities. And what they need to be reminded about is the power that put them there in the first place in the system that's been developed, and that all that power comes from the citizenry granting them the ability to operate and do things on our behalf. When we get to a point where their solutions become detrimental, then we take the power back. It's, they're waltzing themselves into that scenario. Just like when all the money's going to the top and everybody else's wages is flat, they don't have to do that. They can live incredibly well, letting people live well too, but they don't want to do that because they have a sick need to be superior. But the problem is that sick need, you can overreach and you can be dismantled completely and unraveled. And we've seen it happen over and over again. And we also have seen their kind of treacherous promises. Look what they promised Gaddafi. They were like, give us your nuclear chemical weapons program, we'll be your buddy. And then a couple of years later, they use Obama, who's supposed to be, the friend to these nations, and he organizes the removal of Gaddafi. They set up a bank in Libya, and now Libya is a failed state. So we have to be realistic about these things, and we also need to demand of our leaders that they be transparent with us. And this is what we have not had going on. There's a wonderful quote that Catherine Austin Fitts made, which is, we've let psychos run us for too long. And it's true. And I think the best way to regain this is with good policy and having the right people in the right positions and the citizens giving those people the support and pushing back against all of these things. All the power grabs that are going on. So it's inevitable that we come to this. It's not, they're making it worse by locking us down and putting us in a pen, and if they go for that, then that kind of a thing, when it gets unfurled, is very uncontrollable, and they set up their own major problems in the future. Much better if we just get the right people in there and that doesn't happen. That's the way I would look at it. Okay. I'm going to show you a couple of visuals. You know me, I'm very big on pictures. So if picture says 1,000 words. This picture of Trump recently here with one of the Joint Chiefs, and he's in the middle of this coronavirus press conference, but he brings this general forward to talk about their plans of putting these ships all around the Caribbean to stop drug trafficking, a la the hot zone. Keep that in mind. But when you really look at this picture, you're getting this sense, just like when we see Trump not using the presidential seals at these press conferences. Something is wrong. Something is amiss in the chain of command. They have, sat down eyeball to eyeball with him and gone over different things about what he needs to do to contain this. But they've also introduced the possibility of, him getting it or other people getting it. And they're starting to maneuver themselves into that position where they're saying, well, in the event that you do get it, we'll have to have an interim government, and we have a COG thing set up. By the way, Terrence O'Shaughnessy, this is your whole setup for that. Now, O'Shaughnessy is the commander of NORTHCOM, and he's also the commander of North American Aerospace. I always say COG, in quotes, President O'Shaughnessy. And Terrence J. O'Shaughnessy is very interesting. One, he's a Canadian, and he graduated to this position of running NORTHCOM after he was running Pacific Theater operations out of Hawaii. And he was actually in Hawaii when that strange nuclear drill went off. And that was in early 2018. And the people in Hawaii remember because it said incoming, and everybody was freaked out. But he was the key officer there when that was taking place. So it's very odd to me because either it was one of those things he needed to do to prove himself, or they put him in this uncomfortable situation to see how he would react, and to see how the public would react. Terrence O'Shaughnessy was pretty much under the radar until a Newsweek article brought him forward about 3 weeks ago. And in the article, they suggested two things. They suggested everyone should get to know Terrence O'Shaughnessy because he's the COG commander. And they were suggesting very strongly that the government wouldn't go in its normal presidential succession. It would go directly to the COG version. Now, the COG is kind of a Frankenstein from that 80s thing that Bush and Ollie North set up in the 80s under the guise originally of surviving a nuclear war, setting up a secondary government underground and in mountains. But in fact, they made a very interesting clause at the end of it. They said, it doesn't have to just be nuclear, it can be any emergency. And this changed the entire relationship of the presidency to COG. It became almost like a competing branch because now you have a government in waiting, in essence. This was a very dangerous thing to do, and it was set up, oddly enough, by people like Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney. Rumsfeld at the time worked for G.D. Searle, and they were the ones who created aspartame. So he did a number of things with them as CEO from 1977 to 85. So we have this odd relationship of this pharmaceutical guy setting up continuity of government. Now, he had that history working in the Ford administration of being chief of staff, but for those 8 years, he was a CEO of a company and shouldn't have had any part at all in setting up COG. So these people who came back with a vengeance during 9/11, that is Cheney and Rumsfeld, they got to execute partial COG during 9/11. They got to try it out. And they were the ones who'd set it up so many years earlier. So I want to show COG as something that doesn't just exist in a vacuum. It has a long recurring history of people planning and utilizing it. And as Professor Scott pointed out, it is used in every major deep event that has ever affected the American consciousness since 1963. Those are all deep state players who have something to do, worked in some way with COG. So we have to take a better look at it because there's no access to it. Here we are with a constitutional government, legal structure, and we have a completely unaccountable black agency that at any time could assume the leadership of the entire country. So we need to understand COG better, and we need to demand more transparency. There's a way to preserve the kind of secrecy they need in case there is a sneak attack. We've done a pretty good job of that since we dropped the bomb in 45. So I would say, there's a way to get that out. Now, the trend is actually moving the other way. I want to point this out. This is a Federation of American Scientists paper, Secrecy News. Pentagon asks to keep future spending secret. So you can see they're moving in the wrong direction. And in the article, they're talking about the recent budget, and they say the Department of Defense is quietly asking Congress to rescind the requirement to produce an unclassified version of the future year's defense program database. This is a really big issue because that is the American people losing even the smallest semblance of accountability from these people. And this would be disastrous. Catherine Fitz talks about FASB 56, which is FASAB 56. And FASB 56 allows the government to, this is a rule enacted under the Trump administration. For all you out there who think that Trump is just Mr. Transparency, I got news for you. But he wants the ability to take any line item in the budget and make it black so that the public doesn't know how much we're spending on it. So FASB 56 is a fascist rule because it no longer allows that back and forth. Now, going further, these guys now want to take the actual future spending budget and make that, even though we pay for it. And by the way, the NDAA bill that was signed just before Christmas, that bill, when you look at it, is $750 billion for 1 year for the military. Technically, we're not even at war. So let's think about that.
Good point.
Yeah. I mean, what are you doing with $750 billion on the record? And now you want to take it black because you want more money and you don't want the ability for us to know what you're spending it on. That's not how things are set up in this country. You guys are accountable to us who put you in power. The military can't run around with a secret budget. First of all, that's very tempting for them. It gives them delusions of grandeur. Eventually, they're going to fall on their face. The military is structurally in the Constitution in service to the civilian government. The military is a fantastic instrument. But if you have manipulation of that nobility of the military chain of command, maybe it's the CIA who, by the way, are running around and saying, oh, well, we told Trump this was going to be bad. They want to come in and look like good guys again. And you're going to find CIA all over the setup of COG. As a matter of fact, the people who came back in the 80s, one of them was Richard Helms, who was a disgraced former CIA director who was involved in the Kennedy assassination. You have that guy setting up the doomsday bunkers. So we have to rethink who's been setting this stuff up and our own accountability measures. I've suggested on this program with the current situation, and I'm very serious about it, that there needs to be a civilian commission, an intermediary between the government and the public during this period. And that intermediary commission, this council, should have the ability to check the facts on the vaccines they want to give people for coronavirus with real doctors who are not beholden to government or corporate America. They should have real journalists on it who can check the facts on the politics and the hype. And they should have real number crunchers to see where all that money is going that they're giving away in bailouts. It's the only way this is going to work out properly. We can't trust the politicians to do it. And the politicians don't trust the public. They keep trying to fool them. So there's a cycle of disrespect that goes round and round and round. And eventually, they're going to roll tanks and people are going to resist. That's not good. America was founded on something completely different. And it's that freedom in America that gives us the ability to lead the world in giving them the first pushback on this. And so that people can look to America and say, oh, that's how it's done. This is crucial. And I mean this in the most kind of cooperative way, that a council would be the greatest thing, and to have a kind of civilian commission of people who weren't overly attached to corporate America or the government. That's what's necessary, because people will hear that voice. Because what's growing in the country, in independent media and alternative media, is we're starting to get a much better picture of the reality of what's going on the ground. And the media is just trying to take their money and hype and push us into something else so that we give up our rights. So we need some kind of an intermediate interface to organize a situation like that.
Ian Potter has an excellent question. How does more bureaucracy help? Why not full public disclosure?
Well, it's the same thing. You would use a council's not bureaucracy, because all it is a civilian representative that is not as part of the government or part of corporate America. And so it's informational. So the idea is you'd get transparency. If you could call on an information council, it's actually a better way to do it. They would give people the proper information. And you could say that the press could do that, or the independent media could do that. But I feel that we have people in our midst. I could name some people like RFK Jr., for example. And I know that tonight I want to mention this, that the Kennedy family is going through a very strange tragedy once again with RFK's granddaughter and her young son missing. And it sounds like they're doing a search right now. What was the last thing we heard about that?
They found the canoe, but they haven't found them yet. They haven't found any bodies or anything.
Well, everybody's hoping for the best there. That's very, it's a terrible thing. And we know that the Kennedys know all about tragedy. But this is definitely something we're hoping to maybe get something good to report on that. But in any case, everybody's thoughts is with the Kennedy family tonight. But I do feel when we look at this, we have to, instead of just, we know the problems with the people that are trying to initiate these things like Gates and all the rest of it. We need to suggest something that would work. And I think a civilian council is something that's crucial for us to consider. Okay, we're going to go deeper into why. One of the things I want to point out is while this is happening, while everyone's supposed to be like that spirit of America, people are singing out their windows and don't worry, we'll get through this together. And, all of these business leaders are saying, that's right, America, don't go to work and don't worry, you'll get your $1,200 check. I was going to say, unfortunately, up here in Cambridge, that's not going to do you very well. But that won't even pay a month's rent up here. So
not even close.
But I will tell you this is kind of a good reality check. Okay. And this is from tonight. And Catherine Austin Fitz tweeted this. She says, 21 trillion is missing from the U.S. government and the member banks that run the New York Fed that processed those transactions and received $29 trillion of bailouts can afford private jets because it saves them time. How nice. And the story is Goldman CEO buys 2 jets for bank in break with tradition. For years, there was an allergy inside Goldman Sachs to owning a private corporate jet. But now they've just picked up, in the middle of all this, they're picking up bargains. This is how they're using their time. These guys are buying private jets. Are you kidding me? and you're supposed to sit at home and lose your business and lose your livelihood while they're hyping all this stuff. And we're supposed to be kind of believing that they have our best interests at heart. They don't. So I feel that we need to kind of take those blinders off and see the situation for what it really is, and then deal with the middle managers as best we can and reclaim the country in this case. But the country has got to get back to work. And, threats of Armageddon notwithstanding, we've faced all kinds of enemies before. We defeated Hitler, and so the idea that you can dress everyone down because we're having a health crisis, which a lot of doctors disagree on, by the way. And those numbers that they talk about, the grim milestone and all these other things, they expected much larger numbers by now. They predicted 500,000 in the Imperial College report. That's what got all this stuff started. Then the Imperial College came back and said, well, maybe 20,000 in the UK. How's that? So after they create the frenzy, then they come back and try to claim some legitimacy. I've made a point that Fauci himself has now come down on the death rate. And he said, well, the death rate is more like around 1%. There's a quote in a report he put out, and they've often said, well, this isn't like the flu. But he said, in terms of the numbers, it's more like the flu, because the numbers of MERS and SARS have much higher, 10% death rates and things like that. So we're much more in the flu aspect. They're just, tracing, how does this go person to person? And they're like, well, there's so many undiagnosed cases. Well, the truth is the undiagnosed cases lower the number, because the more people you have, of course, the lower the death rate. So if you have 1,000 undiagnosed cases, that lowers the death rate even more, because you're going to have more cases that are at that smaller number. So it's inevitable. Their eventual prediction goes down. I'm not a doctor, but I am a journalist. I have been
You're
able to
also very good at math.
I know spin when I see it. And what they're doing is taking a situation and that is actually happening, and they are taking it to the moon for everything they can get. And while they're doing that, this other thing is crawling up and piggybacking on it, and that is the whole COG aspect. That is the removal of your constitutional rights for a crisis. Emergency powers, the seizure of emergency powers. How many things about emergency this and emergency that have you heard? Now, it seems to me they've put themselves in a box, because they've said, we have to have this in place till April 30th. Okay. But you better have things working by April 30th. Because if you don't, and you start to make this an extended program, and Bill Gates starts standing up and saying, well, you need to hang out for a year and a half in your apartment, while he is hanging out on a yacht with champagne, and this guy's buying private jets, that's not, it's such terrible optics. I'm amazed that the people who are behind this are allowing these optics. And they want to portray themselves as these great, incredible sort of philanthropists of humanity. And what gets me is, instead we think of them as the latte sipping crowd at Davos, who organized how to take over small business and cripple the economy for themselves so they can roll in the Internet of Things and smart cities and everything else. That's how it's looking. So you can prove to us that it's different. But if you continue to keep this lockdown going while those numbers are going down, then you're betraying your own public trust. And the consequences are yours, inevitably yours. On our side, however, we have to, you see a lot of people in the fantasy that the media is drilling them up, and we have to go with facts, not emotionally, but just present as many facts as we can. What's horrible too is a lot of these things are being hijacked. CNN's new,
What's their tagline?
Yeah, their new tagline. They're doing this thing now where they're saying facts can bring us together. Facts. Can you imagine getting facts from CNN?
Right. After Smith-Mundt. Right.
Right. It's literally one of the worst places I'd ever get facts from. These are the same guys who said Russian collusion, WMD in Iraq, lone shooter Lee Harvey Oswald. 9/11 was a bunch of terrorists who worked with box cutters. I mean, come on. Those are your facts? So, and there's another thing where the Washington Post has a tagline, which is "Democracy dies in darkness." Yeah, well, you guys are about as dark as you get. You've been run by the CIA since Katharine Graham back in the 60s. So what are you talking about? Anyway, everyone, you're watching the X series, Dark Journal's X series, episode 84. We're going deep here on the deep state COG plan for controlling things through the crisis. And what we're going to get into now is I'm going to take a deeper look at who all is involved. And we're going to take a little head fake to history. I want to remind everyone we're going to be taking questions in the second part of the program. So ask them in quotes. Olivia's put them together. How's the temperature out there?
Great. Who was that person who was out buying yachts or jets or?
It is the Goldman CEO. Yeah,
okay.
there he is. And Fitz points him out because, Fitz is always, everyone seems to have their one kind of enemy on the planet. And Fitz's enemy has always been Goldman Sachs. Mm-hmm. But she's always been able to see through them and see through what they're up to because she worked in that milieu. And thank God that we have her on our side.
So for a minute, you were hitting on the Internet of Things and what the end game is, what the ultimate agenda. Could you actually elaborate on that for the audience?
Yeah, well, certainly there's a number of things that are going on beyond just the crisis. And what they are suggesting in the middle of it is you're going to need this digital tattoo vaccine in order to have a pass, to go to work or to do anything. Eventually it'll get to, well, you need that for a driver's license or a passport or anything. That's what they've wanted because they've wanted to be able to identify each person and keep them in a database and track them. And they wanted the ability to control those people. And if you get out of line, they want the ability to basically get the naysayers out and to control things in a very undemocratic fashion. Now, there's a number of levels that goes into, and we're going to get into some of them tonight. But I have to say that this is a bold strike at that because they have not been able, they've received pushbacks. And if you remember, just previous to this, there were incredible protests around these religious rights being stripped when people who didn't want to have their children vaccinated for religious reasons. That's something that's always been upheld, even in very kind of fascist times. Like 9/11 and stuff, that never got messed with. They were smarter than that. But this year, last year, in 2019, there were all kinds of them. And you saw RFK Jr. out there battling in places like New Jersey and places like Maine, trying to push back on that because they were trying to remove the religious exemption, which is very strange. I often make this example. If you have a very small population of Hasidic Jews, for example, in New York, why do you want to force them into your program too? And the things that they say, like herd immunity, none of that stuff makes any sense. By the way, herd immunity is from 1938, and it was somebody's weird theory that they never tried, never tested. And the idea of calling any part of humanity a herd gives you some idea of where their thinking is. But they always rely on this, well, there's herd immunity. It doesn't make any sense. If you're vaccinated, then the whole point would be, you won't be able to get the disease because you have the vaccine. So there are all kinds of people who want to argue about that. I'll tell you this. RFK Jr. is somebody who actually believes in good vaccines, and a number of people do. So it's not about, saying a vaccine can't do something good. Certainly some of them can. The idea is when you set it up for people to go from 6 in 1990 to 78 in 2020, that's a pharmaceutical profit model. That's not a health model. And RFK Jr. in his presentations says that there are 300 in the works. So they're going to take your 78 and bring that up to 378. So it's a never-ending cycle because they can keep saying, well, if we add that one, we'll add this money, add that, add this, add that. That's a profit model. Then there's the deeper aspect of, are they breaking down people's immunity systems? And this gets into all of that eugenics aspect. It has to be asked and answered. There's no question about it. All right, so we're going to jump now as we're moving along pretty well in time. There's a lot to cover. And what I want to go to is something that was happening, which had to do with, of all things, ham radios. And a lot of people who operate ham radios will know about what I'm talking about. Ham radio are these amateur radio networks that go across the country where people communicate with each other. They're outside of phone lines. They're outside of the internet. They are kind of a pure communication route. And something came up before this crisis that I found very puzzling. And that was there were a number of moves to dismantle this ham radio network. Now, they're generally also known as very good in a crisis, and emergency preparedness goes along with this as well. Now, one of the original stories was back in June of last year, and this was local ham radio operators to participate in nationwide emergency preparation event June 22nd and June 23rd, 2019. What's interesting about this for me is they had their own kind of network emergency preparedness stuff going on. So if you had these guys on board, and let's say these COG people wanted to, find an exercise like the coronavirus to roll out COG, ham radios might mess them up quite a bit, because if people still have the ability to communicate on the ground, the confusion level goes down because there's a lot of information getting out. So suddenly they were moving, in California in particular, against these ham radio operators. Now, the fight over this was that California was saying, well, we don't want to maintain the equipment. And what they have are basically these large antennas that they call repeaters, so that when you throw your ham radio signal off, it bounces off. Costs practically nothing to maintain those things. And so then they came up, they realized that they were kind of, caught out in this. So then they came up with something more interesting, which they said, we'll do it, but for all you ham operators, here's this incredible fee you'll have to pay. So they were trying to, run them out on the financial side. Now, I'm going to read a couple of quick things from this. For more than 100 years, amateur radio, also called ham radio, has allowed people from all walks of life to experiment with electronics and communications techniques, as well as provide a free public service to their communities during a disaster or emergency, all without needing a cell phone or the internet. This is crucial. Field Day demonstrates ham radio's ability to work reliably under any condition in almost any location and create an independent communications network. More than 35,000 people from thousands of locations participated in Field Day 2018 activities. Quote, it's easy for anyone to pick up a computer or smartphone, connect to the internet, communicate with no knowledge of how the devices function or connect with each other, a communications manager for American Radio Relay League said. The National Association for Amateur Radio. But if there's an interruption of service or you're out of range of a cell tower, you have no way to communicate. They like it that way. Ham radio functions completely independent of the internet or cell phone infrastructure, can interface with tablets or smartphones, and can be set up almost anywhere in minutes. That kind of thwarts a lot of your COG action. The shutdown. You might remember that back in California late last year, there were a number of fires, and there were all these strange stories about PGE, Pacific Gas and Electric, shutting down the power, which seemed like an unusual thing to do. They hadn't done it before, and they caused a number of blackouts. There was one of them back on October 26. More than 2 million people expected to lose power in PGE blackout as California wildfires rage. Now, in the story, PGE's planned power shutoffs would leave as many as 2.7 million people without electricity in what could be the state's largest planned blackout in history.
Wow.
Los Angeles County and Sonoma County have been under a state of emergency since Friday. So they did kind of a dry run of emergency before all this happened with these strange fires. And in the middle of that, they tried a blackout. Now, they intentionally shut off the power to see, if they could stop the fires. That was the main official story on it. But they hadn't done that before. Widespread, dry, hot, windy weather was the reason, etc. Then we've got California officials declare ham radio no longer a benefit. Demands ham radio repeater infrastructure to be removed. This is all happening at the same time. It seems to me that emergency moves are happening behind the scenes there. But the blackout part should cause us all to think a little bit about blackouts. Not, we've heard a lot of things bandied about on the internet saying, 3 days of darkness. And, we have all these people who make predictions and they're always wrong. And they say, this terrible thing is coming. I got intel and all the rest. But that doesn't mean something like a blackout couldn't happen. So I don't want to go on the fear side of they're planning this blackout, let's get ready. I want to look at blackouts for a moment. And I want to look at it in terms of what they're doing on the COG side. They're opening up emergency bunkers. I've spoke about this last week, and I'll speak about it again. Last week, I talked about how they opened the Cheyenne Mountain emergency bunker, and that it was our friend, President O'Shaughnessy, TJO, Terrence J., who was at the forefront of that, talking about, we're doing this because we want to reposition and get ready to fight that enemy of the homeland, the virus. It's an odd thing to do. Also, in terms of optics, it's terrible. Because how would you like to be in the middle of the kind of crisis that we're in right now and see all these people who are in authority running for these bunkers, running for the hills, essentially? That causes more panic. So what kind of a message is being sent there? Why is Terrence J. O'Shaughnessy, the Northcom commander, in our face on CNN and Fox and Newsweek, and now showing us that he's piling up this doomsday bunker in Cheyenne Mountain? It's unusual. I can tell you from tracking this stuff, and it was Professor Scott who sort of turned me on to COG. I didn't really know about it until I read his work a long time ago, because he's been talking about it for years. But what's interesting about O'Shaughnessy is the people who are in that field, they don't come out and tout themselves as doomsday commanders. O'Shaughnessy's different, which tells me that they're planning in some way to either utilize him or to run an operation to see what it would be like for people to accept a military commander in an interim basis. That's the story. Hey, you know what? Trump and Pence got the coronavirus. Don't worry. We can't do the normal presidential succession. But here's this guy. He's a Northcom commander. He's going to get us through this. We're still in a crisis. When it's over, we'll have a new election, get a new guy in. But in the Constitution, it's very clear that your constitutional moves go straight from the president to the vice president to the Speaker of the House, and so on down the line. Now, we have to look at why they're monkeying with that. That's where we can get into what's going on with this crisis and what's piggybacking on top of it. Everyone, you're watching The Dark Journalist, a show. We're in episode X series now, 84. We're going deep on bunkers and blackouts. This is the deep state COG plan for crisis control. And how are we doing out there?
Good. Shelby Coper's asking, and quite a few people have asked the same question, why isn't Trump separated from Pence? Is it COG?
Now, this is fascinating. You would think that he would be. There's no question about it, especially during this period. They did recently set up tests for anyone who meets now with the president or Pence, but it seems strange that they just announced that. I mean, the coronavirus has been in its heyday, right? So I'm not sure why they just thought to do that now. You would have thought they did it a long time ago. I'm not sure about what they're trying to get across by saying that. But let's take a look here at what may be going on with O'Shaughnessy. I came across something that fascinated me, and it was, I was trying to find out, well, you know, I know that the Bush administration had set up rules for COG, and they had someone who worked as an intermediary. And it was Dick Cheney who was the person who actually utilized COG and went into a mountain with 100 people and came out with the Patriot Act. That wonderful document. Not exactly George Washington there. A little more goose-stepping on the goose-stepping side. So I tried to check out who in that succession right down the line would be handling COG. And I know the commander they have in mind, which is O'Shaughnessy. But who is the person who's handling all that setting up of how that works? So there is somebody's position who's actually called the National Continuity Coordinator. This person's very interesting, and we need to get into it. Now, in this document that I found, that's their actual signature. And that's their title, their National Continuity Coordinator, an assistant to the President for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism. Now, I found that in the Trump administration, this person has been switched out multiple times into different people. And this position keeps flipping over, which is pretty odd. I'm going to go into other administrations, but it looks like the previous administration only had one. It looks like Trump has already had 4 in 3 years. A little bit interesting. We know Trump likes to fire people, but this is getting kind of interesting. Now, the person who took over for Thomas Bossert is someone named Julia Neshawat. Julia Neshawat has kind of an interesting background. Let's see if I can find her full-length picture here. She is an American National Security Advisor, currently serving as the 10th Homeland Security Advisor to the Donald Trump administration. There's your X for her. Big time. Did you catch that one?
I did not.
It is very interesting when you think about it. After the September 11th attacks, Neshawat served consecutive combat tours for which she was awarded the Bronze Star Medal in support of Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Iraqi Freedom. We need to know who these people are who are operating inside of COG and coordinating this activity. Julia Neshawat, I'm sure she's done good government service and deserves the job, and Trump chose her for that. But if they're going to be using COG, we need to know who these people are and what their background is. She has a very interesting background, actually, having been in combat in Iraq. Her parents were Jordanian, actually, even though she was born in America, which I found that interesting. She went to the Tokyo Institute of Technology and Georgetown University also. So she's the daughter of immigrants, and she grew up in Florida. There's not a whole lot more about Julia, except she has all those Homeland Security credentials. But I think that the deeper aspects of who is controlling continuity of government planning, who's controlling those bunkers, what kind of plans do they have for assuming authority in the event of an emergency, like, for example, a pandemic. And can they, for example, commandeer, the presidency based on a health crisis? There's nowhere in the Constitution for that at all. Continuity of government is entirely extra-constitutional, not envisioned by the founders at all. It's a complete stripping of the laws of succession that the founders put in place, which were very clear in the Constitution. You can't miss them. They say, this is the lineup, this is the succession trail that you go down. There's no reason to throw that out, because a couple of planners who were close to the pharmaceutical companies and close to Wall Street and close to oil interests in the 80s decided to take nuclear deterrent government ideas and exploit them for their own purposes. Now, when we go deeper into COG, we've found for every deep event, as Professor Scott has pointed out, and I think everyone should get educated on Professor Scott's work to understand COG better. But you're going to see how deep this goes. In the deep events that have happened, the JFK assassination, Watergate, Iran-Contra, the October surprise, where we told them to hang on, to those Iranian hostages until Reagan gets in office. That was a Bush move. Iran-Contra, which involves thousands, millions of dollars for drug trade. That's how we got the crack epidemic. Look at the Dark Alliance book. All of these deep state, deep events had COG people at the heart. Ollie North at the heart, the ultimate COG person at the very heart of Iran-Contra. Bush and Rumsfeld and Cheney at the very heart of 9/11. All COG. John Dean, who basically turned in his client, Richard Nixon, to the special prosecutor. He's the one who got Nixon out, and he was his lawyer. When you're somebody's lawyer, you don't have to say anything. And it's interesting to think about Dean because he's somebody who predicted that President Trump's presidency would end in disaster. It's interesting coming from a long-time COG player. And what I think we need through all this is not to say, well, we're going to have this damage our psyche, and as a country, things will never be the same again, and you'll never shake anybody's hand again, but gosh darn, we'll get through with it. No. This whole thing is going to make us look at the secret structure of government that's been controlling things, the dangerous players who are exploiting a crisis. That's what it's going to do. That's where we need to get our heads wrapped around it. Now, Northcom is something that was created out of the ashes of 9/11. Northcom, which Terence O'Shaughnessy heads up as the general, and he's also a member aerospace commander. There's always a space side to this stuff. Even with Rumsfeld, there's a huge space side. But Northcom is another thing which we didn't have till 2002. It did not exist. And Northcom is, we used to put army commands in places like South America. So if something got out of control, if there were drug companies and drug cartels operating in Colombia, we'd have Southern Command that could go down there and handle those guys and prevent them from causing a crisis on our borders and all the rest of it. Northcom is a very different mission. The way that they've set up their mission is that basically they have to keep an eye on the American people. The American people are their problem. And that's something that was also never envisioned in the Constitution. There should not be a Northcom that has the command over the North American citizens. That doesn't make any sense. The North American citizens, the citizens of the United States, have, under the law of the Constitution, their legal representatives in Congress and the presidency. They're not run by an army. The army and the military is under the civilian control. Northcom changes all that around. Northcom makes the civilians under Northcom control. So the combatants, the enemies in that situation, from Northcom's point of view, is anything having to do inside America that's a problem for them. So that's where, we mentioned there was a plan called X-84 where they worried when we were in war situations in Central America with El Salvador and the rest of it, that citizens might get out of hand, especially citizens who had attachments to Central America. But if there were large-scale protests, X-84 was basically martial law, that they would round up people and they would use things like stadiums to hold them in. That's a real plan. That's not some Alex Jones fantasy. It really happened. And it was done by Oliver North using this whole COG-FEMA connection. So there's a very dangerous interface of non-constitutional activity and emergency powers, which is how we got Hitler, it's how you got fascism, it's how you got Mussolini. This is what they do. They come in a crisis and say, voila, here we are, we're militarized, and you are our subjects, and we'll take care of you against the terrible evil, the invisible enemy of the virus. This is the thing that needs to be watched, because the thing that stands between you and the abyss is the Constitution. It cannot be missed. They are under the Constitution, regardless of this phony thing that they've set up for COG. It is not constitutional. The people who set it up acted illegally in setting it up. They used an executive order when Reagan was at the end of his presidency, and we already know Alzheimer's was kicking in. Reagan came in with a certain set of ideals, but he had Bush as his VP, who was a CIA director in the 70s and was involved in all kinds of nefarious activities, and he wound up running a lot of the government. And guess who was sitting at the top of the COG setup? Bush Sr. Who gets to use the COG setup? Bush Jr. But I still think that they did not complete the action because it's a long-term scale plan. This, however, using this crisis where people are shut down, introducing Terrence O'Shaughnessy as this kind of voice of reason commander coming out and giving interviews. This guy's hidden in Cheyenne Mountain. How is he coming out and giving interviews? Why is he talking about taking people, special visitors, into Cheyenne Mountain? We have to get to the bottom of COG. COG is not a lawful institution. It is a complete aberration of the Constitution, and they're rolling it, they're piggybacking on top of this operation with COG. So the faster we strip that illusion away, the quicker we get back to constitutional government, which is what we should have in the first place. All I'm saying is, let's get back to constitutional government. Fair enough? Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're deep in X-Series 84, and continuity of government is our subject matter tonight, is this deep state takeover. Now, the bunkers and blackouts thing, we covered a lot of what they could do with blackouts and some of the unusual moves that they were making to try to ban things like ham radio. We're going to be taking your questions here shortly, but before we get to that, Miss Olivia, how's it going out there?
Good. I'm going to ask you this question.
Sure.
Okay. Shelby Cobra wants to know, but why now? What is the urgency? I'm going to add to that. Are we at war with China? Because I'm actually getting the sense that we are.
Interesting.
And that this has to do with the Space Force and global control.
There are geopolitics involved. I don't think there's any question about it. And I think your instincts are right on. There's a history for how this whole op came about. And the official story, which you always have to dig deeper on, is that it came out of this Wuhan market and they started having these cases. And then there are other stories about this World Military Day where we had some people over there and they came down with symptoms. But again, the symptoms that they came down with, not that terrible. I mean, they had a fever, they had a cough, and they recovered. So when we looked at this through the lens of other things that have happened, it's very interesting to look into Professor Scott's work because he goes back and he looks at the Anthrax Scare that came on the heels of the 9/11 attacks. If you remember, 9/11 happened, and then all of a sudden there were these strange anthrax things that were coming everywhere. And people were getting mailed letters that had anthrax in them and all the rest. Now, we have an entirely unusual and, again, unconstitutional situation in relation to biological labs like Fort Detrick in North Carolina. Fort Detrick was shut down because of unusual activity late last year. So they were aware, the people who shut it down, that there were strange things going on. We had the arrest here. This guy literally, his office was maybe about 5 minutes from here. And this is Charles Lieber, who's the Harvard professor. And I'll tell you this about Lieber. This is a very strange story, and we need the details sooner than later to get to the bottom of it, because the idea was that they were paying him $50,000 a month on record. We don't know what they were really paying him or promising him. And that he, in essence, was sharing research having to do with biological warfare and nanotechnology. Now, a lot of people have looked at this, have suggested that both of those things could be involved. There is a professor, a scientist out there named Francis Boyle, who thinks this was a bioweapon that was released accidentally after they bought it from America and were using it over there. His research is very interesting. I can't speak to the fact of if those things happened or not, but what we do know is we've got these professors arrested just before the big wave around this happened. And they were, also there are other professors, some of them in North Carolina, who were getting into these relationships where they were sharing university research around these sensitive areas with China. So China was buying that. Now, when we look at that, that makes a lot of sense about how this got started in the first place. In terms of the severity of it and calling it a bioweapon, they could have been in a stage of developing it. And the problem is a lot of doctors don't even know when they look at it. It's so similar to other outbreaks like the flu, etc., except apparently it's more catchy. And since they're lowering the death rate, it's going to look a lot more like the flu. And this, again, comes outside of the mind control media thing where it's the Black Plague. Let's get out of that for a minute. Let's look at it for what it looks like on the ground. If it is true, then this aspect of looking back into what they did with anthrax coming out of that same lab has a lot of correlations. So this was picked up on by a number of people. If they go back into Scott's work, he has the real lists of this. Whitney Webb? Mm-hmm. Whitney Webb did an article on it recently about Dark Winter. I printed out something that she wrote as well, and I'm just going to grab one quick section of it, and I highly recommend her article on this. Dark Winter is the name of the exercise that was taking place in June of 2001. And this was the one where they were looking at biological agents, and that's where anthrax, they believe the Anthrax Scare came out of. Briefly, from the article by Whitney Webb and Raul Diego, quote, after examining Dark Winter, it then became important to examine the events of the exercise seemingly predicted, namely the 2001 Anthrax Attacks. This is particularly crucial for two reasons. First, that the source of the anthrax was later traced to a domestic source, allegedly USAMRIID lab in Fort Detrick. And second, the mode of attack and the initial narrative of those attacks were straight out of the Dark Winter playbook. Dark Winter was one of these exercises where how do you deal with a biological attack? Furthermore, key players in the government response to the anthrax attacks, including those with apparent foreknowledge of the attacks, as well as those who sought falsely to link those attacks to Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda, were also participants in Dark Winter. We have to jog our memory a little bit about after 9/11, there was this big rush to link it to Saddam Hussein, but there was nothing on the surface that connected him to it. Nonetheless, we went into Iraq in 2003 anyway, which was a huge foreign policy blunder. Now, there are a lot of levels to this Dark Winter exercise and how it overlapped. I just want to grab one little piece that is similar to what we're dealing with the whole Corona part. Quote, Dark Winter further discusses the suppression and removal of civil liberties in this exercise that they were doing. Suppression and removal of civil liberties, such as the possibility of the president to invoke the Insurrection Act, which would allow the military to act as law enforcement upon request by a state governor. Sound familiar? You seeing all these National Guard being released everywhere? As well as the possibility of martial rule. Who came out and said, I can call martial law if I want to? It was Governor Gavin Newsom, after completely over-dramatizing the amount of cases that his state could have. And he was using those numbers to announce to the world that he could announce martial law, which is incredibly draconian, unconstitutional, and he does not have the ability to do constitutionally. The Dark Winter script also discusses how options for martial rule include, but are not limited to, prohibition of free assembly, national travel ban. They've been kicking that one around. Quarantine of certain areas. Quarantine, you hear this word a lot. Everywhere. Quarantine, under quarantine. Stay quarantined. Suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, arrest without due process. That's right. You know, we just saw Barr ask for those abilities quietly behind the scenes to Congress. We want indefinite detention. We want to be able to hold somebody, arrest them, hold them, and not let them have a trial right away. Maybe we'll keep them for years. That's not constitutional. And it's not legal. And the emergency that they've put forward to justify it doesn't measure up. So what are they doing? Why the power grab? Well, many of these were all in this Dark Winter exercise. Finally, military trials in the event that the court system becomes dysfunctional for American citizens. You can almost imagine people who like to believe in this fantasy version of white hats helping, saying like, hey, it's good. Military tribunals means that we'll get revenge on all these people that have done all these terrible things. I haven't seen anything, means zero, to prove any of that hope, porn, optimism. I mean, here you are locked in your house, daydreaming that there's some weird white hat out there. It doesn't work that way. Think about, how the country was founded. You have to go back to that. How America was founded. America was founded because the situation of the king in England was becoming repressive. And they decided at a certain point, you don't have that authority over us anymore. We're independent. And when the Brits said, well, we're going to tax you and you're going to cough it up, or we're going to send our military in, we had a huge fight for independence. That's the way it worked. We had to win that war of independence under incredibly difficult odds. And, those soldiers who were frostbit and all that and fought and won, they weren't worried about whether they were going to get a fever. I mean, their future and their country was at stake, and they went into action. Now, we have to look at this situation and see how the foundation of the country gives us the setup of the Constitution. And that when the Constitution is taken out, when it is overruled, and that we find people who are planning exercises back here using with this health force, task force, and CDC and all these edicts that are coming out, they're using things that sound an awful lot like these exercises. It's a fact. They've been working on plans like this for a long time. Question is, why are they using them? That's the question that we need to really get deep on. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Here we are, X series episode. We've had a lot of episodes in the past few weeks that dealt with guests and all these different ideas. We had Nick Begich on, Dr. Joseph Farrell, and we've been getting a lot of intel, a lot of info about what may be happening here. We're going to be bringing you a lot of those people and very important guests coming up for April. And I want to recommend that you go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. Stay in touch with us. The social media section is shaky. You bet that in a lot of these plans, getting rid of the naysayers and the people who are challenging the official narrative is crucial. And the best way to get rid of them is just to shut down their microphone. And so we have to be on the lookout for that. So if we have your email address, then it's much easier for us to stay in touch. So go ahead to Dark Journalist and sign up for that free newsletter and make sure that you get those emails from us. Miss Olivia, how you doing out there?
Doing great. So Najat Laundry was asking, any chance anyone from the Trump administration is watching these episodes?
Well, I'd say yes.
And what leads you to believe that?
There's all kinds of interesting things that happen that would lead me to believe that. But I would say in any case, the fact of anyone watching them and sharing this information is valuable, because here's what I would say to President Trump, which is, I think, where you were going. The president is actually at incredible risk if they are doing this COG piggyback. They might even be saying to him, this is a good thing, it gets the crisis off your back, and then you can come in afterwards and we'll postpone the election and move it up, and you'll use this kind of bridge with Biden, or they'll get rid of Biden by then. They'll have somebody else in there. I've thrown out that idea of the unity ticket before. I'm still sticking with something like that. But I think they might say to Trump something like that to have him go along. And I'm starting to feel that Trump is going along sometimes and not going along other times. I had a long conversation with Joseph Farrell about when they announced the COG Terrence O'Shaughnessy commander in Newsweek. And we both agreed that that's when Trump started acting normal again, that he didn't like that plan. And that he said, we're opening back up on Easter, April 12th. We got to move forward. You can't keep this country down. Those are the types of things that we need to hear. And those are the things that he needs to stick to, in my opinion, because, now he said, look, April 30th, we need to lock everything down till then. It sounds to me like they're getting to him in different ways and saying, if you contribute to this, it'll be looked at as you causing all these deaths and all the rest of it. And when you're in politics, you have to take those into the calculation. Like I said, in terms of cooperating with the middle managers and the people who are dealing with this, I've always been of the opinion they're just executing orders and information. The way we can help them and help ourselves is by getting to the bottom of a couple of things. One, continuity of government. Two, why are these bunkers opening up? Israel just opened its bunker. Why do we have Terrence O'Shaughnessy, the head of Northcom, who would assume command under COG rule, making statements like this to the public? General compares Department of Defense's COVID-19 response to all-out war. All-out war is when you go in and you try to decimate another country. Why would you compare this? Why wouldn't it be the best aid possible that Northcom can muster? Why would you compare it to all-out war? That is from defense.gov. And I found that disturbing. I'm going to tell you, I've spent a lot of time studying O'Shaughnessy, and I don't like a few things about him. I'm not suggesting anything nefarious in his background. I'm talking about him as a military commander, his mindset, which is very much like a movie that JFK got help to get made called 7 Days in May. And they made a movie about it with Kirk Douglas and Burt Lancaster. It's actually a very good snapshot of that period. And it is the tension between the executive branch and the military, when the military thinks it's right. Nonetheless, the situation is that America has civilian control embedded in its constitution. You cannot remove the civilian control. Can't be done. That is the core of the country. The civilian control over the military is the fundamental handshake of liberty at the foundation of America. That's what made us different. So you can't remove that with some weird people behind the scenes creating this thing. And what's really funny is I'm going to read a quote a little bit later, which is really going to sum it up. And it's quite fascinating that it's starting to occur to people just how unusual this is. But in any case, that's one quote. Here's another one from O'Shaughnessy. U.S. military considering all options for coronavirus aid. All options?
I never liked that phrase.
What does all options, you know, I mean,
Nuke
one,
the planet.
yeah.
That's an option.
All options? U.S. military is analyzing all options in the battle against the novel coronavirus pandemic, which has spread throughout the country, infected more than 203,000 people. So they have ships deployed and all the rest. We're looking at all options, General Terrence O'Shaughnessy, commander of the U.S. Northern Command, told Fox Business. So whether it be ships or whether it be continued use of some of these transition to other areas, so we're looking. The Department of Defense is looking at all options. He made this quote again over here. General compares DOD's COVID-19 response to all-out war. I mean, it's insane on the face of it. You're involved in an exercise to help bring medical supplies to people. You're not bringing bombs to them. So how is it an all-out war? So these are the things that bother me about O'Shaughnessy. Over and over again, he will speak of the homeland. And I made the comment that looking through pages and pages of his interviews, I found something quite fascinating, which was that O'Shaughnessy mentioned in 6 different interviews, he mentioned homeland. Are you ready for this? 67 times. He mentioned the United States twice. What's the problem? Well, the Constitution is under the United States. Homeland is just something Bush and his cronies dreamed up after 9/11. Homeland is like fatherland in Germany. That's a Nazi term that I've never resonated with for America. This idea of homeland this and homeland that. And he'll sit there and blab on about homeland this. I want some of those people to stop him and say, are you talking about the United States of America? I mean, is it America that you're talking about? Can you say United States of America? You seem to have a problem saying that word. It's very odd. For me, when you look at the United States of America, the Constitution's embedded inside of it. Over here, if I just call something homeland, I can give all of these different characteristics to homeland. We defend against the enemy. We do this, we do that. But I don't have to refer to the United States Constitution anymore. There's a lot of power in the name. So it bothers me that he is the top Northcom commander, and he sparingly uses the term United States of America. I invite anyone to look through his interviews and find what I found. His frequency of using homeland over the United States of America is incredibly disturbing. Once in a while, he'll say nation. You know, I guess that's the trade-off. Yes.
Christine Taggart, DJ, who is O'Shaughnessy's boss?
Well, Northcom, in any military setup, the commander-in-chief is the ultimate boss of Northcom. But it is interesting because the Joint Chiefs of Staff, there's a whole process around that. The thing is, Northcom it's an artificial setup. It wasn't here. You know, when you think of the incredible things that we did, say fighting the Cold War against the Soviets, and, you know, when the Cold War fell, all these other things that happened, the fall of the Berlin Wall, Northcom didn't exist. It had no function. It's only in 2002, out of the Homeland Security, out of the Bush administration, out of the COG push, out of the we're under attack and, you know, here's the threat level graduated. That's where this weird Northcom thing came from. The Army commands used to look out. So, as I said earlier, if you're in South America, you'd have Southcom. They'd be dealing with making sure those drugs didn't come up from the Colombian rebels, or if something broke out, whatever it happened to be. Northcom looks in. Northcom we used to be under, normally, police. That's how it works. Somehow, and I had this conversation with Professor Scott many times, somehow we're under Northcom. It's a very interesting twist. And this may be the fruition of all of that, that small group who were just obsessed with power planning this incredible exercise. Now, they have other plans. There are things that interface with this. It just seems to me the COG part is what's climbed on top of what we're doing here. Now, I want to mention, since I mentioned South America, there's been some very unusual things that have happened in relation to Venezuela. Venezuela, it looks like Pompeo, who I have suggested President Trump should fire immediately because he's such a warmonger, a former CIA director, and he's the one who was really pushing for our assassination of Soleimani at the beginning of the year, number 2 man in Iran. A totally terrible idea. They killed him in Iraq, and almost sparked World War III right there. They're making other moves where they're using bellicose language against Iran. It's a terrible idea. They're also making moves to install their guy in Venezuela. Look, we may not like the leader in Venezuela. We may not like his brand of socialism. We may think he's a disaster. That's for his people to decide. We cannot install leaders. That's a CIA move. That's Pompeo at the front, and he is not doing the Trump administration any good. He needs to be removed. But these things are happening. So there was this unusual setup of a Venezuelan ship that fired at an empty cruise vessel. It's getting too close to the coast there, and then somehow sank itself. So there's a lot of unusual things. I'm trying to go deeper into that story, and I don't have all the details with me, although I printed out some stuff about it. I don't like that activity, especially after hearing Trump beefing up the Caribbean. Whenever they are in the Caribbean, and they're, you're dealing with the hot zone, you're dealing with a very tense situation. Yes.
Is it true that Venezuela doesn't have a central bank?
Well, they've had a lot of upheavals because of all the different pressures that have been put on them, and their government has made different types of mistakes. So they have thumbed their nose at that central banking system, and their money has gone through the floor, and we've seen the runs on basic necessities and things. Look, it is up to the people there to, we can be a good influence from the side or whatever, but we can't roll in there. And plus, they have Russia and China behind them, so you run the potential of sparking a world war. This is not the 80s, and that's not El Salvador. You can just roll in there and roll some Contras in there. It's a big country. They were oil rich for a long time, and they have Russia and China giving them aid. And so you run the risk of really setting off a huge war. The other thing is, have some class. If this Corona thing is real, as you say, then lift sanctions on places like Cuba and Iran, at least for medical supplies and things like that. It doesn't make any sense. The whole idea, it's interesting to go into this. I could do a whole show just on this. Here's the snapshot. Supposedly, if there's one person in this world who has this virus, it's a danger to everybody. So in Iran, they have conditions where the toll goes up and up because they don't have the right types of supplies, and we have sanctions on them. So theoretically, for our own good and for the good of our European neighbors and all the rest, we would theoretically be giving medical aid to Iran. It's ridiculous to hold harsh sanctions on Iran and Cuba under these conditions. Absolutely absurd. Even for our own good. So how does that make any sense? Wait a minute. I thought this thing was the most dangerous thing since the Black Plague. You willing to let it grow because you don't like a country's politics? Who's running the show? You got to ask these questions. Okay, so we're going to go to your questions. I want to just jump through a couple of quick things that I promised to follow up on. How are you doing over there?
Tons of great questions. I'll be able to ask a quarter of them, I think.
Everyone, I want to ask you, do you remember someone named Clark who came out of the Bush White House. He wrote some very interesting books about being in this kind of weird situation after 9/11 and how they had been warning Bush about bin Laden's plans and all these different things and how their warnings went on deaf ears. Of course, we know that a lot of that set up around Tim Osman, Osama bin Laden, was strange to start with. And we've done a lot of good things with him. But I want to get into just a quick quote from him about this continuity of government side.
This is General Wesley Clark, right?
No, actually, it's
Okay.
thank you for mentioning that. I'm going to get directly to him. I seem to have, there it is. No, it's Richard Clark.
Okay.
And Wesley Clark's very interesting in what he gave us. Okay, here we go. Richard Clark, counterterrorism czar on 9/11, regularly participates in a series of highly secret continuity of government exercises. This is from the Washington Post now. April 7th, 2004, almost 16 years ago to the day. Throughout the 1980s, the COG exercises rehearse how to keep the federal government running during and after a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the exercises continue, but based instead around a possible terrorist attack on the United States. In 2004, Clark revealed that he had participated regularly in these exercises over the previous 20 years. 20 years, since 1984. He recalls they had gone off into caves, into mountains, in remote locations, and spent days on end in miserable conditions, pretending that the rest of the world had blown up. And going through the questions, going through the drill, he adds, quote, "Everyone there play acts that it's really happened. You can't go outside because of the radioactivity. You can't use the phones because they're not connected to anything." He also describes the COG plan requiring coded communications, saying, quote, "There's an elaborate system for the people in this network. First of all, to verify each other's identity, that person on the other end has a certain password and information that they have to pass for us to believe that they're who they say they are." Clark was a senior Reagan administration official when he became Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Intelligence. After being a member of the National Security Council since 1992 and 1998, he is appointed as counterterrorism czar, May 22nd, 1998. And then it quotes a different article. Okay, according to journalist James Mann, the COG program is of particular interest because it helps explain the thinking and behavior of the Bush administration in the hours, days, and months after the terrorist attacks of 9/11. Clark is in fact responsible for activating the COG plan the first time it is ever implemented, September 11th, 2001. It's on record. Clark, who had a tendency to be glib and transparent when he spoke, he's talking about how it worked. It's like, yeah, for years, 20 years now, they had me going to these caves, and I was part of this whole play act rehearsal for when COG would become active. And they partially activated it during 9/11. It's crucial because the idea of fully activating it, I mean, you can see just with a partial activation, all the draconian things that came down, wireless wiretapping, the Patriot Act, the TSA, all these different things came out of that. That's just a partial. That's just a preview of things to come. So, but I wanted to get that Clark piece in. The only other thing I wanted to read, which I think is crucial, is Bush changes continuity of government plan. This is interesting. May 10th, 2007. President Bush issued a formal national security directive yesterday ordering agencies to prepare contingency plans for a surprise decapitating attack on federal government and assigned responsibility for coordinating such plans to the White House. This is a change. The prospect of a nuclear bomb being detonated in Washington, blah, blah, blah. That's what they've said. The order makes explicit that the focus of federal worst-case planning involves a covert nuclear attack against the nation's capital, in contrast with Cold War assumptions that a long-range strike would be preceded by a notice of minutes or hours as missiles were fueled and launched. Quote from the National Security Directive. As a result of the asymmetric threat environment, adequate warning of potential emergencies could pose a significant risk to the homeland, might not be available. Therefore, all continuity planning shall be based on the assumption that no such warning will be received. This is a 72-paragraph order, National Security Presidential Directive 51, Homeland Security Presidential Directive 20. The statement added, emphasis will be placed upon geographic dispersion of leadership, staff, and infrastructure in order to increase survivability and maintain uninterrupted government functions. After the order, Bush assigned 100 senior civilian managers to rotate secretly to locations outside of Washington for weeks or months at a time to ensure the nation's survival. Quote, a shadow government that evolved based on long-standing continuity of operations plans. On the actual White House reference to continuity, and there's not much, they use the term themselves, shadow government. It's undeniable. It's right there on the White House website. So now we all know what we're dealing with. It's secondary government in waiting, and it comes up to the edge when it sniffs out an emergency happening. But here, is it pushing itself in and making itself visible just as an exercise, or are they moving for the real thing? This is the question. The only way you get an answer to that question is to go to who they're touting as the COG commander, and that's O'Shaughnessy. Classic. And with that, Miss Olivia, the floor is yours.
I'm going to go straight into bunkers. This is interesting. Dash Rendar says, DJ, are bunkers the next war front? In 2017, the Army poured $572 million into training and 26 of its 31 active combat brigades to fight in large-scale subterranean facilities.
Yes. Underground. You know, we've had people on the show before who've done great work on the underground bases, bunkers. Richard Sauter, we did a couple of interviews with him. There's a whole network there of an underground world because they've set up an entire different infrastructure, and they've got the black budget operating it, so we'll never see where it is. You know, whenever they talk about these strange things all over the world where they hear, like, you know, these horns or these sounds, this grinding or whatever it happens to be, I always think that's that underground infrastructure getting, you know, doing construction or whatever it happens to be. And that's the kind of thing that makes sense to me. There's no question now that there's a certain segment, you can call them kind of the bunker population, where they think that they're going to be saved in the event of an asteroid strike, a nuclear strike, a breakdown of society, because they can go run to these bunkers. And we've seen some of those bunkers and the luxury bunkers, you know.
They're great looking, very comfortable.
They think they can wait it out for 10, 20 years and come back and rule the place after those pesky, you know, commoners are done. But boy, is that a big mistake. I do feel, though, that it's a significant danger when people start getting into that mentality. This is what's so sick, in a sense, and what needs to be drawn out is there's a kind of illness that gets into that. When you get at that power level and you start planning like that, it's, if you've ever seen Dr. Strangelove, there's a lot of that too, where the military planners start planning about, you know, starting the world over again and this kind of thing. When you get yourself into that type of situation and you're in a position of power, it warps, you know, that kind of power corrupts. And that's why the citizens keep a check on it. And that's why it's so crucial for us to be aware of these types of things and not just live, you know, hang out on what they say. For me, you know, the media is in lockstep with that because they're kissing up to a system and they think that they can get in good with that system. But
they think they're going to get dragged along, but they're unnecessary
right.
when there's no vermin left.
Exactly.
Right? You think the media class is going to make it to the bunkers? Not so much.
No, I mean, think about it. Do you really, you really want to hang out with those guys? You really want Chuck Todd in your bunker? I don't think so. also the fact that they can be bought will be used against them.
Right, you have to think in terms of the mafia.
Yes, absolutely. I always think about Hitler when he goes to meet Neville Chamberlain, and Mussolini and Hitler meet with Chamberlain, and there's this problem because Hitler has built his military back up when he shouldn't have, and he wants to take over the Sudetenland, and their whole thing is to avoid war at all costs going over there. Neville Chamberlain, he's an appeaser. And when he leaves, he basically signs a thing that says, we'll look the other way if you go into the Sudetenland, but we won't have a war with you. And so when he takes off and he sort of wags around this piece of paper and says, peace, we have peace, we're not going to war with Germany. And the quote from Hitler's assistant later is that Hitler leans over to Mussolini and says, wow, our opponents are worms. That's important because if they feel like you are appeasing them and that you won't have any resistance to what they're doing, then they really amp it up. They think that they don't respect their enemy, and then they really go into overdrive. So it's not trying to appease that kind of draconian authority is never a good idea. So, I think when we look at situations like that, you can see what even a situation like this could grow into if, it's so funny to me too, when you think about dictatorial powers, all over the media, they've been screaming about Trump and saying, oh, he's going to be a dictator and all that. And then as soon as this thing shows up, they're all like, hey, seize states' rights, close this down, close these people down. If these people go out, give them a fine, order a national lockdown. They want him to act like a fascist dictator all of a sudden. Isn't that odd? How does that work? So let's take that to heart about how out of control a situation like that would get. Now, I can easily see that using this kind of middle manager thing, that if they go to the end of April and they're like, okay, in May, we're going to start opening up things and all that, this will be this chapter where they tried all this stuff and there was a lot of overreach. And I can see it moving in that direction potentially. And in that case, we have to be very vigilant about making sure that type of constitutional overreach never happens again. However, we also have to be ready for them not to do that. And so we have to consider to ourselves the most important thing, which is seeing through this type of activity. And I don't think that, I think it's important to stay very centered in dealing with it. And I don't think it's good, though, to be, like we've seen some things ricocheting around in independent media, like, hey, Trump is taking all the bad guys to some island to execute them. It's not happening, so we need to be very practical in one sense, but not very panicky in the other.
Well, we're sowing the seed of deception. And so the best thing we can do is rely on the facts that we have, and hindsight's 2020 and past is prologue. So, what can we figure out would be the logical rationale for all of this, right? And we have a lot of facts at hand. So why create fantasies,
No question.
Because they're more comforting.
No question.
Obviously.
The fantasy part is very, it's interesting to me because my thinking around that end of the spectrum would be that, those people looking at things from that perspective would actually be going in the other direction, thinking, oh my God, martial law is upon us, and they would overreact in that sense. And, there are martial elements at work here. There's no question about it. And that's where the danger is. So I could kind of relate to them on that level if they were having those types of fears and concerns. This thing about imagining that if you just hang out in your house and eat popcorn and don't take part in the political process and hang out on a chat board, that everything will magically come out right. Hey, it's like The Secret. You remember The Secret? It's nice to have a positive projection, but not to the point of, it's like the guy sitting on a bench imagining he's a rock star not getting a job. Eventually he's going to get thrown out of his house and be begging in the street. So that's not good. So obviously there's something there which says you can't just imagine that something good is going to happen. It has to be met with effort on your part. And that effort should be raising a very loud noise against draconian measures taking place in this country and in other countries. It's totally legitimate, and you have a microphone to do it, and you should use it. And in terms of cooperating with the middle managers and the official proclamations and things, I've always said it's important to cooperate as far as it goes. And if the Trump administration plans to run this to the end of April, I think he loses a lot of points for doing that. But I can see a possibility that we could go along with that, and then May 1st, they start to open up the country and they put in that infrastructure. That would be a scenario where, he could sort of promise, this thing to the public and then open it up. If they try to delay past April 30th, you're going to have such a societal shutdown of, it's such a breakdown of the economy and everything else that there's no point in going along with the middle managers and all that stuff at that point. It'd be absurd because you're inviting them to destroy the very fabric of the society. They can't be that stupid. So then you'd have to wonder what is behind this and has that thing that piggybacked on the back of it. And then I think you'd start to see large-scale protests. I can't see any other way around it. I hope it doesn't get to that. I would like to see them come to their senses. And that's what I'm working for, by putting the information out. I want us to be aware of what's happening. I think the more awareness we have, the less they'll be sitting there thinking, we can get away with this. It's very dangerous how much acceptance of these draconian measures we've had already. It's already a gigantic overreach. And I'm not comfortable with any of it. Even with the good reasoning of we're having a health crisis and all the rest. I understand those things. I don't doubt that there's a crisis involved, but they have amped it to such a level, and never in the Constitution did it say this stuff counts except if you have a health crisis. It doesn't work that way. Either you have a law of the land that people follow or you don't. So what's the nature of the situation that we're in? That's what we need to get to. And I think that if there is a COG operation going on, they're more likely to back off if they've been outed. I don't think there's any question about it, but it doesn't look to me like they've got that message yet. Okay,
I'm going to link these two questions. So a cult fan is asking, what does a real revolution look like in these times? Ratboy Genius says the end game may be to manipulate the people into riots and destruction and chaos.
Yeah. Well, we'll take the second part first. If I can basically manipulate you into a state of disassociation and lack of identity by changing all your habits and destroying the things that you rely on in your world and threatening your ability to provide for your family, then we're in Germany in the 20s, basically. And so anything can happen out of that.
Can we talk about that a little bit? You know a lot about that.
Yeah, we will. Mm-hmm. What was the other part with the cult fan, though? He said, what does a revolution look like now?
What would it, or could it
possibly?
Yes,
that's a good question. Revolution, there are all different kinds, of course, but considering the American Revolution, we have that in America. It's like in the DNA of the place because it was arranged that way from its inception. It's got it. It's in the warp and woof of the country, even when they try to cover it over with all these other things. So fundamentally in America, it would all come back to the Constitution. That is the kind of shield that was meant to save us from a situation like this. And how it would actually play out on the ground is very interesting, because I think you would have people collaborating to put pressure on the government to return to the strategic situation. And there's lots of different ways that that could play out, but I think you'd end up having this intermediate council as a result, where you'd have a group that was central as a liaison to the actual population that wasn't trusting the authorities anymore. And that group could act as an intermediary between those two. It seems crucial to me in this period to do that. And, revolutions can be ugly. They can go quickly. They can take many years. There's a lot of different ways to look at it. But certainly, fundamentally, what they've become disconnected with, dealing with software and virtual worlds and all that, people are flesh and blood in the final analysis. And they will come in groups, regardless of your corona scare. If you try to put martial law on a country and turn a constitutional democracy into a fascist state, they will come physically for you. It's inevitable. So, but I think the revolution of ideas is the crucial part, because, that type of battle is exactly the kind of thing that they're geared up for, because, an establishment that went fascist has so many tools at their disposal. The public pressure, however, of awakening people to what's happening, that public pressure and the dropping of the mask, probably, in my opinion, is the safer, sounder way in the grand scheme of things. Yes. You said something about Germany?
We'll get back to that in a second. What is the saying about petitioning the government for grievances?
Yes.
Under COG, would we be able to do that? Do we have those rights as citizens?
It's interesting you said that, because I was literally going to go down the Constitution and the Bill of Rights to show how many things are being violated as a result of these lockdowns, including freedom of assembly. Freedom of speech is interesting, because they're giving us some freedom of speech, but they are also shadow banning the speech. So that one's right on the verge. We all know the right to bear arms. Certainly they don't mind people buying tons of those at this point. They've decided to go in this other direction. But the ability to gather together, and this is the crucial thing they've gone after. They figured it out in some kind of a matrix somewhere, that gathering for church, gathering together during a political year, expressing those ideas, getting together, that's been the big thing that they've gone after. And constitutionally, there's so many violations in the heart of this that, when they come out of it, let's suppose they're like, hey, the virus is over, but we're going to install these things. Like, you can't, smoke past 6 o'clock at night, or, whatever it happens to be. You can't keep your bar open past 9 p.m. or whatever they happen to do on the most basic level. You can't stand within 20 feet of your fellow employee, all this stuff. They can incorporate a number of draconian rules and keep us all confused and fighting each other while they are gutting the country and its wealth, which is, they've been sending that up, as we've seen, if you look at those charts, financially up to the top for so long. But the weird thing is, it's top heavy. And if that doesn't get balanced out with a pendulum swing, you get this kind of weird situation. And a lot of people have said, well, maybe this will balance out, because a lot of the stock market went down. They had inflated that thing, all the way back to 9/11 with the false housing market and the crash and bailing out this person and that person, Goldman Sachs. And the Federal Reserve is bailing out all these banks and their friends, basically. So they're up to the same tricks. And in the meantime, they want us to go through, it's a defining moment for America. It's going to be defining when they lose their jobs. Otherwise, it's just a real block. It's like a real stumbling block they've put in front of so many people. And I think it's a dramatic overreach. that's what I'm looking at. By the way, there are real hardcore things that, for example, the nuclear threat, which is gigantic. And in terms of, destruction of the environment, these things all go back to the corporations and the governments that help them accomplish the destruction of the environment. They shouldn't come to, this is the amazing thing that gets me. They try to make people, there's this whole thing that people in the independent world aren't supposed to care about the environment. Oh, we don't believe in any of that. There's no destruction of that, and on their side, they've said, hey, climate change, you have to pay this climate tax in order to help us recover the economy and all the rest of it. No, they were the ones who sold the goods. The governments were the ones who approved the pollution standards and all the rest of it. If anybody pays that 10% tax or whatever it is, it's those corporations. And the government should be turning around and making them pay for it. If they feel there's a fundamental environmental issue, if there is climate change as a result of our industrial activities, obviously it's the corporations that would pay for it. There's no doubt. Because they were the ones who benefited for so many years for drilling oil and causing pollution and destroying the ozone and all the rest of it. That's a simple one. How could you get people on the ground to pay for it? This is the thing that absolutely fascinates me. And I think that we should always resist those types of moves and make them sorry if they bring up climate change and taxes, because the taxes belong on them. Okay, go for it.
All right, I want to make sure that I ask these, so I'm going to ask them now. Native Virginian wants to know, why do they hate humanity so much? Are they human?
Well, that's a real X-series question.
I have to tell you,
yes.
Intuitively, I mean, I've always wondered, but I like to conclude things that are evidence-based. I think that's the real issue, personally, that we're dealing with here. It's the only explanation that makes sense, is that they're not quite, let's put it this way, the humans on the planet are not all created equal.
Fascinating. I like that. Look, some of the greatest minds in the world have wondered what's going on there. I think that it raises a question about when you become so disconnected from your spirituality that you become the plaything for all kinds of occult forces. And that if you look into Steiner's work in talking about that harmonic force that we've done so many shows on, by the way, that all comes through the technology. And the technology, which is a great asset to humanity, but can be misused as to the development of the person, that the person becomes, basically, their development becomes retarded. And as a result of that, when you're looking at people and when they start acting in an inhuman fashion, and we start to see that scientific wave, people who are willing to use nuclear weapons to settle disputes, this is where the rubber meets the road, because you either go into this with some kind of a spiritual lens and ethical understanding of humanity, or, you basically go by law of the jungle. What's interesting is the scientific materialism that's grown up around us teaches a kind of spirit-free mentality. And that mentality, which is supposed to be right over and over again, by leaving out this whole other portion, by leaving out the spiritual, ethical aspects, misses, most of what it means to be a human being. So it's a very limited window, this scientific materialism. And, we've made a number of shows about how there were groups who saw this wave coming in and try to protect us from that kind of materialism taking over. And if you look around at society before this happened, it wasn't going to such a very happy place. But there was this awareness stream that was moving forward. And I think a lot of this that we've seen has been to thwart some of that awareness, because we were getting to such a degree, and we're going to get there even more now, but that awareness level was rising even in quarters of the public that you wouldn't expect it. And I would talk to people who had no awareness of any of these subjects, or the deep state, or corruption, or even deeper things like psychic experience, or the UFO file, any of that. So there was something there's something in us that's starting to awaken, and boom, you have this other thing operating side by side with that. And it's that kind of Kardashian, I hate to throw it all on them, but that kind of culture, and that really degrades people. So you have a very degraded population on one hand, and then you have this awakening taking place, and they're side by side. And I think that the grand masters, the grand controllers, just want the degradation part. They don't want these people awakening or getting on their level. And they're operating from a very low level of their own ego, for sure. Yes.
Okay. David Tormina, DJ, if they eventually tell us that the virus was of ET origin, it could be the opening act of a staged von Braun-style alien invasion.
Look, you've got a great point. Here's the thing. We saw so many stories leading up to this about UFOs. It was incredible, right? And they were trying to push groups that were linked in deep with the CIA, like the TTSA, who now don't, kind of just retweet the CIA on the UFO side. And the CIA did a very strange tweet on April Fool's Day and said, stay at home and read all of our UFO files. And they did. They linked off to it. Very, very strange.
So weird.
I mean, think about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, what are they preparing people for?
I think the idea fundamentally is possible because they put so many things into place. Because one of the things where they try to co-opt the UFO file was they realized about 2015, 2014 that it was the top search anywhere in those Google results, in those search engine results. UFOs were the top thing people were curious about when they were just on their own, spending time at home. I think they realized at a certain point, we've been blocking and exploiting this stuff in media. There's movies, there's all this stuff about it, but we're not getting the real control of the narrative. People are curious about this. We have to turn that curiosity to our advantage. And that's where I think you get these groups. In terms of turning this into a UFO thing, no, but I'll tell you that I think the fact that they were kicking around just previous to this and moving the UFO subject to the front tells me that it's one of the competing things that they're thinking about playing with to get that kind of a we'll surrender our rights thing going with. And I've always felt von Braun's words to Carol Rosin were very fascinating and seem very fortuitous and precognitive now, looking over the 40 years since he mentioned it. I'll tell you another thing along this line is that there is an asteroid out there larger than Jupiter, which we're going to be able to see in our night sky in April. This is odd. This is odd because it's larger than Jupiter, and they're calling it Atlas.
It's 5 times the size of Jupiter.
It's 5 times. Think about that. Jupiter, which is gigantic, it's so much bigger than Earth. And you get something 5 times as big as that. We'll see it in our night sky in April. If we were Mayans and we were looking out at that night sky and this thing showed up, we probably knew it was coming if we were Mayans. It would be very significant. So for us, we need to tap into that primitive side of ourselves and saying, they've got this thing that they're doing. They're shutting down the world. And we have this strange light that we're going to be seeing this month. It has some of those aspects where you see it as like a change of culture. It's kind of like so much more 2012 than 2012 was. So we're definitely, we're in for it deep. Yes.
So Don Forbes asks, could the original owners of the planet be returning? And Ed Kaufman says, an alien invasion would be ideal in a blackout. I wouldn't rule this out. We have to
Hey.
be prepared for anything.
That is fascinating. Look, I did a lot of research on two blackouts: the New York blackout of 1965 and the New York City blackout of 1977. And I wanted to see how those details worked. I'll tell you, there was a great degeneration of the culture and the way that they helped each other from 77 to 65. In 65, people were like taking care of each other's property and bringing each other meals and stuff. And by 77, they were breaking windows and burning stores and stuff. So that's an interesting culture shift that took place. But if you study the 1965 blackout, oddly enough, there were incredible sightings of lights in the skies previous to that blackout. And I wouldn't be surprised if there were an off-world culture that was investigating how we responded to things that might sort of take the power out and see how we do. Oddly enough, there are stories about Lyndon Johnson, who was the president at that time, unfortunately, and he was traveling during this period, and he wanted to know the origins of these lights. He wanted to know if that was related to the blackout and all. And I think that tells you a lot, because remember, in the Senate, before he got rolled into the vice presidency and then the presidency, he was known as Senator NASA because he was so close to the space program. So I've always thought that story was interesting. By the way, in studying the 77 blackout, I definitely was observing that some of it seemed engineered also, that it didn't look like it was just a natural happening of the conductor going down. And I guess I'll talk more about that eventually. But I think it's interesting, given the state of the culture in 1977. That was quite a test run as well. But for the people who had to go through it, look, I do want to say this: if anything like that were to take place, that it's important, the type of essentials that you need in an event like that are definitely backup batteries for your phone and things like flashlights. That's just essential, and it's always good to have. We always talk about the candles and things like that. But also, it's important not to lose it in a situation like that too, because the most important thing would be helping people who really couldn't help themselves in a situation like that. So you'd look for opportunities like that. But I do think it's important for us as a group, as a mindset, to be prepared for these groups to take advantage of the disorientation of shutting down our environment. I hope that they don't, but I think it's important for us to stay on top of it, and most importantly, not to lose our head. That would be my main thing. And make sure, since you have time in advance, to have some of those backup things available. And not everyone can afford, very fancy backup stuff. So, but even little things, even if you have a little extra battery for your phone, if you have those types of ways to see through a dark evening with candles or whatever, it's good to have that. I think a blackout is quite possible given what the nature of the thing. And they could always say, well, there's so many people using equipment, and because they were home, and we had a blackout in this region, and it might not even be that big of a deal necessarily. But it's important to keep an eye on it. I've floated out that they've used the blackouts in California to try to get rid of ham radio and stuff. So they were already into ham radio communication elimination, and then they were also into taking out the power. Because they did those tests before all this happened, I want to look to those as referral events for now. And it doesn't matter if someone says, well, they're not connected or whatever. It doesn't matter. We're just going to use them as referral events because they're close time-wise. So the potential of knocking out communications, the potential for knocking out power is there. So we need to be aware of it. Luckily, most of the country, the weather's pretty good in April. So we're not dealing with this during blizzards or anything. That's helpful. And I love a rainy night. Okay.
Esoteric 369 Wall says the blue star Kachina, perhaps?
Oh, isn't that fascinating? Wow.
We should think about that.
Yeah. Well,
maybe include it in our next episode.
A number of cultures, I mean, the Hopi in particular, but a number of cultures have given us that hint that there's something that we'll see in the sky that will be the signal. This Atlas asteroid, I think the timing is very interesting, along with the fact that we had a couple of asteroids blow each other up upon entry recently. I think it has to be looked at. No doubt about it. Okay, yes.
Okay, so what about this Indian blackout, which is either happening on the 4th or the 5th for 9 minutes at 9 p.m.?
Yeah, well,
Prime Minister Modi is ordering. What do you know about that?
It's interesting to look at that because I don't think they ever tell you the real reasons. And I think that the California blackouts, PG&E, are very instructive in terms of looking at how people coped with it. And suddenly, there were a lot of people who got interested in emergency preparation as a result of that, which I think is a really very good trend. And it's too bad that California is under such terrible leadership of Gavin Newsom because, they have the ability to work together as citizens there in a fantastic way. And, there's so many things that come out of California, like spiritual movements and all kinds of things that speak to community. And it's pleasant all year round and all that kind of thing. You really feel like they could deal with the things that are going on and be a model for the rest of the country. Unfortunately, instead, we have the weasel of a mayor in Los Angeles shutting off power and water for businesses that don't cooperate. And Gavin Newsom talking about martial law. So some of the worst leadership. And then they have Pelosi, and they had Barbara Boxer, Dianne Feinstein. It's really,
there's a rent strike going on there. Did you know about that?
Yes, very
People
interesting.
putting signs in their cars.
Anything,
so we have to follow that closely.
Okay. Anything else about that?
That's all I know so far. So Guitar Dave wants me to correct my statement. It's 5 times as bright as Jupiter, not 5 times the size. I was reading someone's questions.
No, but I've heard it's immense. So you're right in the ballpark.
Yes, and I guess it's the gases around it make it seem larger than it actually is underneath.
Yeah, I heard it was larger than Jupiter, though, so it might be a little bit of both there.
Okay.
Excellent. Keep going.
All right. So what's going to happen with the election? Are we going to have an election? What would happen if there's still lockdown come November during the election?
Well, first of all, I think if Biden comes out and says, look, there's no way that President Reagan can control the situation. Only I can. This is the weird thing about Biden is his brain is referring to facts and dates. And, he's in public, but he's living out. It's like doing that life is flashing before his eyes. It's like a life review at the end of his life, but we're all getting to see it. And he's supposed to be answering important questions. If you can't handle a scripted thing in your living room with your bookcase behind you, if you're starting to flub that, that's not even a stressful situation. This has been the weirdest election because
I know it just keeps getting weirder.
It does. Well, the thing that was really driving it were all these people showing up for Bernie or showing up for Trump. Those are the people who had real people on the ground. The Biden thing was just, he was the Democratic insider. He doesn't have any real following. But Biden being very close to Kerry, and I find Kerry's presence very important. I feel like we're going to see, there's a reason why he's shown up so much. And for me, Kerry is part of the key for the 2020 election. But what are they going to do with it? They're talking about doing it, voting online, which can be so easily manipulated. Why bother?
With Soros machines.
Yeah, well, the other thing they could do they could use this whole crisis against Trump, as they've started to do. You know, he's gone along and played ball for a while, but then it'll be like, oh, he should have handled this sooner. What a terrible response. You know, it's very tricky territory. They've just opened now a congressional inquiry led by witch hunter herself, Nancy Pelosi. Got to look in the mirror sometime. And she is doing this witch hunt on the Corona bailout in the Trump administration. So it's supposed to be, you know, can we get him in trouble there? And I think people in general in the public are tired of them doing that with Trump. You know, it's like he survived the Russian collusion nonsense. He survived all these different things that they try to throw at him, impeachment, which was a waste of time because they didn't have the votes. Why waste American taxpayer money? But they just, it's like they live in oblivion, right? They're going through the crisis and everything
They're in their
else.
own bubble.
They are. And, you know, the only thing that Trump was vulnerable on, in my opinion, was assassinating the number 2 man in Iran. They could have done a congressional inquiry into that, but they didn't care because they wanted to do it too. So this is the warlike mentality on the liberal side and on the neocon side. And when the neocons get Trump's ear, that's not so good. Now, I hope that Trump doesn't listen to those voices, and he does better when he sticks to what he was elected on, which is keeping us out of foreign wars. But they're talking bellicose again, and that's Pompeo and Trump talking about Iran and Venezuela. That's not good. So my suggestion for Trump, open the country at the end of the month, and no wars. Keep us out of war. And you'll get reelected. But if you go to war and if you keep the country shut down, you know, then it'll be like the worst of the Bush-Obama combo, and they'll ride you right out and install a puppet. So my advice to him is get rid of Pompeo immediately. He has to be dropped like faster than fast. One of the worst secretaries of state we've ever had. There are articles going around now that Pompeo, while Trump is trying to deal with this coronavirus thing, is actually coordinating war powers to try to get into Venezuela and Iran. Think about that. This guy has no regard even for his boss, you know, and he talked him into Trump's worst move, which was killing Soleimani. You know, that is illegal. And so Pompeo is responsible for that, along with Gina Haspel, Buddy Gina over at CIA, as she's known, because she handled all the Bush torture stuff. So that's not a good crew to have in there. I would get a new Secretary of State immediately and a new CIA director.
Okay. So O'Shaughnessy, is there any chance that he will become the one world government leader?
Well, this is an interesting thing about O'Shaughnessy. I have to tell you, this is someone who bothers me for a lot of reasons. But O'Shaughnessy, as a military commander, again, he's probably done a good job in that role. But the thing is, the idea of a military commander, you know, just like General Patton shouldn't have been a dictator over America, you know, you can't, there's a separation there. It's the civilian population that elects a civilian leader to guide the military. This is not a military dictatorship. So this is my big problem with them touting O'Shaughnessy. Now, what I've seen about O'Shaughnessy that I don't like is what I've pointed out earlier, which is he's bellicose in his language. Even when he's talking about the virus, he's talking about annihilating it, using all options on the table. That's a guy who, you know, is like Curtis LeMay. He's ready for World War III. And to install a military leader like that, even temporarily as president, is completely unacceptable and constitutionally not viable. Therefore, the entire operation, emergency operation, becomes illegal. So what do you do if you're the population and you have an illegal military governor ruling over you? In terms of if the New World Order would use it, I think that if they feel, it's very much like Hitler. If you study World War II and the lead up to it, it's quite fascinating. Actually, John F. Kennedy wrote a very excellent book about it when he was a young journalist, and he called it Why England Slept. And the idea was, why didn't anybody stop Hitler when he was violating all these treaties before the war? Remember, Hitler hosted the 1936 Olympics, and everybody loved him. Newsweek had him on the cover. He was smiling like, hey, Hitler hosts Olympics. And you think about how advanced the Germans were. They had television in 1936, and they broadcast that thing everywhere. They were so far ahead of America, which didn't get TV till 1950. And there's a certain point, though. It's when Hitler marches into the Rhine. And the idea is, if he can march and not get stopped, he doesn't fire a shot. It's just that this is where the treaty boundaries are. So when he does the march and he gets away with it, that opens the door for all this other stuff. Had he been stopped there, then he would have realized there was resistance, and World War II wouldn't have happened the way that it did, which is just him firing off bombs at everybody, thinking nobody's going to resist me. I've built up all these weapons and all the rest of it. So not tempting the predator, the dictator, is good policy, and I highly recommend that in this case. But when COG gets touted by Newsweek, and they have O'Shaughnessy on every broadcast from Northcom and what Northcom can do, I mean, really, should we be hearing a lot from Northcom in relation to the coronavirus? They don't have much of a function in relation to medicine. I mean, you have the traditional army helping out the National Guard. All right. But Northcom? I don't know. And then the worst part of it is him flexing himself in front of Cheyenne Mountain and saying, we're getting all these people in here, as many as we can get. I just can't tell you who they are. Special visitors. Makes it sound like everyone's heading for the hills. You know, that kind of thing is meant to stir fear. So I don't like the trend of O'Shaughnessy at all. And but I don't know how they how the New World Order would use him. I think that if they try to install him as COG commander, there it is. That's their ultimate fantasy come to life. And he's Canadian, by the way, which we love Canadians on this program, and I know many of them. But
have you been able to look up any of his kind of bloodline connections?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I just wanted to make the point that if you're not born in America in the Constitution, you cannot hold the presidency.
But so, he can if he's head of COG, it doesn't matter, right?
Well, this is the thing. Their version of COG cancels out the Constitution, but the Constitution doesn't say, hey, you can add COG and cancel me out. So it's completely extra-constitutional and illegitimate. This is the weird, very weird situation we find ourselves in. Everybody, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're here deep now into COG. We're going to take a few more questions. And this is X Series episode 84. We're looking at blackouts and bunkers. There's another bunker, nuclear war bunker, I'm going to show. And I also want to remind you to go to the Dark Journalist website and sign up for our newsletter, which is free. And this is important because we've seen so many things getting shut down. Can you believe the amount of things that they're just censoring? We were watching Joseph Farrell's news from the Nefarium, and they were just slicing and dicing his dialogue. It was incredible. Do you remember?
It was
that?
Disturbing.
Yeah, it's something
very hard. So it's hard to follow. So people say they give up, right? That's the point.
I would think so. I want to show you a couple of things from the White House website. I kid you not. This is whitehouse.gov. Well, let's take a look at that. It says, the shadow government. Following a catastrophic national emergency, the president or his successor can authorize the establishment of a temporary shadow government to maintain control of the essential functions of the federal government. President Bush activated the shadow government on September 11th, 2001, shortly after the second attack on the World Trade Center. So it's been activated. They know how to do this. Every federal agency has designated key individuals to be part of emergency relocation groups. These ERGs are assigned to an alternate secure location on a rotating basis and are ready to take over the duty of supporting the national essential functions of this nation in an emergency. COG-CON levels. Here they are. This is the public side of it. Those are the COG-CON levels. That is COG continuity levels. And level 4 is federal executive branch government employees at their normal work locations maintain alternate facilities and conduct periodic continuity readiness exercises. Federal agencies on COG-CON 3 and departments advanced relocation teams warm up their alternative sites and capabilities, which includes testing communication and IT systems, ensure that alternate facilities are prepared to receive continuity staff in the event of an emergency, track agency leaders and successors daily. COG-CON 2, deployment of 50 to 70% of emergency relocation group continuity staff to alternate locations, establish their ability to conduct operations and prepare to perform their organization's essential functions in the event of a catastrophic emergency. COG-CON 1, full deployment of designated leadership and continuity staffs, Terrence O'Shaughnessy and whoever he's got, to perform the organization's essential functions from alternate facility, either as a result of or in preparation for a catastrophic emergency, like Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado. So all those things fit in there. I found this interesting too. Executive powers. 2012, President Obama issued 2 executive orders to greatly expand presidential powers in the event of a national emergency. Guess we all didn't know that. Here's the interesting one. March 2012 executive order gives the president the authority to commandeer, quote, all U.S. domestic resources, everything, including food and water, and seize all energy and transportation infrastructure within the United States. The order authorizes the U.S. government to force its citizens to fulfill labor requirements for the purpose of national defense. So they have the ability to say, hey, we've got all your stuff and you work for us now. Yeah, there's more there. Last thing I want to mention on this, and we'll get back to your last questions, is something called Eagle Horizon 2020. This is one of those exercises like Dark Winter that I mentioned earlier. I believe that they set this one up and they haven't been able to execute it because of what's happening, or they may execute it anyway. Here we go. Eagle Horizon exercise requires each federal executive branch department and agency to test their continuity of operations plan by deploying their emergency relocation groups to secret remote locations where they will perform their essential functions, ensuring the preservation of our government. In addition to all executive departments and agencies, the White House offices and senior staff also participate in this exercise. Eagle Horizon uses scenarios like improvised nuclear device detonation, earthquakes, and cyber attacks. So Eagle Horizon 2020, I believe, was meant to be performed in May and June. We'll see if they use this emergency to kind of do a simulation of the real thing, or, as we've seen, just go for it. Okay, yes.
So Kate Schneider said, what is this, Game of Thrones 2020?
That's really great. I think that that's a fantastic way to put it. We're certainly seeing the masks come off, and I think it's crucial when the masks come off that we be at our best, because it's a crucial sort of process, because at this point, if they move and they're trying to seize power, they also could run into, it's not all one group. This is the problem with the cabal thinking, and we've seen that before and called it out before, like in Q groups, and then, you know, whenever we get around the secret space program, there's always the nonsense about the cabal. But the deep state was devised a little bit differently. If you look at Professor Scott's work, the way he talked about it, intelligence was one side of it. The mafia was another side of it. the financial powers were another side of it. The Wall Street groups, the oil interests, they all have their intermediaries in there. So it is very much like Game of Thrones, actually, when you get down to it. Much more than a central cabal that's just waiting and holding control. So if one group moves, for example, to install Shaughnessy, the group that originally moved to install Trump legitimately, democratically as president, may really object to this activity, and they may be sort of luring Trump further and further into the COG trap. The other thing is, you could look at it and say, you know, it's a possibility that Trump played along with this the whole way and that he's part of it too. It's hard for us to know at this level, but I'll tell you, we see a lot of push-pull when it comes to Trump that doesn't seem engineered. It seems like he's out at times of the way that they want to do things, which is why I think the CIA tried so hard to remove him when he first got in. Like him or not, the idea of the CIA choosing who the president is abhorrent in a democratic republic. So it's a tricky kind of situation when you look at it that way. To install a COG guy as kind of like a hero savior is absolutely ridiculously unconstitutional. You might as well just, you know, have them goose stepping and wearing swastikas. It's ridiculous. And but they tout it in the media as if this is supposed to be a good thing, and like, get into it, meet your new commander, you know, it's cool. And maybe they think millennials will go along with it because they're not supposed to think deeply. I think they think a lot deeper than that. So, and besides that, there's too many people who are invested in the constitutional system in America. And if it really comes clear to them, then they're not going to go for it. Okay.
Yeah, you know, I think we've been seeing this as America, patriots, you know, against the UN, against globalists. And I think something else just happened. And I think we need to open our eyes to it. And that at least this just really resonates with me. I think that now we're at war with China, and it's like a Cold War. And, you know, I have my own theory about how it started. But so it's, we have sort of two wars going on, you know, against the globalists, or the globalists against patriots, but they're both against China. So what's going to, you know, who's going to pair up with who? How is this going to shake out? We don't know. We don't have the power to make those kind of predictions.
I like where you're going with that, because in particular, if they have robots now to take the place of the labor force, the whole reason that they invested so much in China is you could use the cheap labor, you didn't have to have humanitarian conditions, and you know, they'd work those guys 14 hours. Those guys would try to commit suicide by jumping out a window in the Apple factories. And they were like, we won't get them psychological help. What we'll do is we'll build nets, so when they jump out, they won't be able to actually kill themselves. You know, this is the mentality. That's how they are on the corporate side. They think like slave drivers. However, when they get into the idea of having these machines operating and cutting down that human labor force, it's possible that China becomes far less important than it was to them. Because essentially, I was seeing China and Facebook and Google as basically one thing. Mm-hmm. Because they had really reestablished themselves in China. And if you go to China, all those buildings and all the rest of it, all the companies had moved over there. And they had stripped our entire manufacturing base starting in the 80s. So, and as a result, you know, the benefit that we got is you could buy a flat screen TV and it didn't cost you your life savings. So it's not that there weren't benefits to it, but it was too much of a trade-off. And essentially, in a situation like this, we see it really, because we need the ability to produce our own goods. We need the ability to farm our own food. This is the crucial thing that we can come out of this with. They want us to come out of it with, you know, vaccine addiction and addicted to their new world order and the draconian fascist aspects. But actually, on our side, what we need to come out of it with is a whole new appreciation for our farmers' markets, our ability to grow our own food, our ability to manufacture our own goods, our own small businesses. What they've tried to do is get rid of that in one foul swoop. But this is what we can do. We can turn the up. Yes.
I just want to address this. So Johann Wolf says, to me, don't you think it's always the deep states, corporations, oligarchs, Intel, et cetera, warring with each other, and there are parallels in other countries like China? It's not the people against people. No, actually, I think if we actually beheaded the entire group of elites and probably some middle managers, the regular people, the populace, can get along just fine.
Isn't that interesting?
And we'd be better off. So yes, and that's just like Game of Thrones. If we didn't have the heads of these houses all vying for control, because they're greedy bastards. Let's face it, that's what this is all based on.
Yes.
And they want it all, and they consider it a game, and we are pawns to be used and disposed of. So yes, I absolutely 100% agree.
I have to say, I mean, it's very interesting to put it across because they've earned that level of contempt. I think, in fact, though, in America, as far as dealing with American things go, I would like to see those people tried, and I would like to see them found guilty and then have a proper punishment put upon them. So in a sense, I'd like to see them.
I didn't mean beheaded literally, figuratively.
Yes. Well, listen, a lot of people in the audience just cheered when you said that, but I know what you mean exactly. It comes right down to that. I wanted to show this. We've just briefly to touch on it is that we've seen these 5G towers being blown up. Essentially, they've been lighting up these 5G towers. I can't advocate for that, but I have to say it's inevitable when you launch harmful technologies on the public that you are going to get pushback from that. And so seeing these types of things, to me, shows the short-sightedness of those elite forces being like, we're going to roll this out without those safety precautions, and you're just going to deal with it. And, just like with the vaccine thing, like, I'm sorry that your kid has autism, but we're going to strip away, any rights that you have, even religious and medically, to make sure that you get on our system. That's a bridge too far. That's where they've pushed it. And sometimes when you're in these positions, you don't know when to stop and you make mistakes. And I feel that they don't know when to stop and they're making mistakes. So I would like them to take a deep look at the kind of chaos that they're letting themselves in for, and to take a better course than the one that they're on. Okay, one quick thing I wanted to show Judge Napolitano, who we appreciate his fight for freedom. He's a constitutional guy, but he wrote a very excellent article. I won't read the whole thing. I just want to let you guys know it's out there. But his headline is so perfect for this, and it's the question that I ask myself. And remember, he's a constitutional judge. The headline is, what good are constitutional rights if they are violated when Americans get sick? It's a simple question. And then beware a government of fear. That's his article, and I highly recommend it. But let's think about that. What good are constitutional rights if they are violated when Americans get sick? Doesn't make any sense. There's no provisions for that in the Constitution. None. Do you have to deal with medical emergencies? Would you move supplies in? Would you encourage the population with certain health restrictions? Yes. Would you shut down the entire country in an ongoing fashion and move further and further in on those rights? That's the overreach. There's a big difference. And they have it wrong right now. And Judge Napolitano's article, excellent article that he has up there. Let's see, where does he keep this? Well, it's at Washington Times, which they do a good job also. Yes.
So would he agree with Sweden's approach, do you think?
Yeah, actually, the article is very detailed, and I can read a little bit of it just to give us a question. Here's his quote at the top of it, Benjamin Franklin. Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. It's really well said. They were going through the revolution. They knew the stakes. A lot of people said to them, hey, don't go against the king. He'll send the army over here. Those guys are far better equipped. So they took that chance because they believed in their mission. So this is from Judge Napolitano. He says, one of my Fox colleagues recently sent me an email attachment of a painting of the framers signing the Constitution of the United States. Except in this version, George Washington, who presided at the Constitutional Convention, looks at James Madison, who was at the scrivener at the convention, and says, none of this counts if people get sick, right? And that's the kind of cartoon there. So you really, were you checking with me there on that? So it's funny, isn't it? This is what it comes down to. It's like supposedly all these things get washed away because Bill Gates has a mission that you're sick and need his vaccine. It doesn't make any sense. And I'm just using, it's not just Bill Gates, obviously. Now, in these days of state governors issuing daily decrees, this is more from Napolitano, purporting to criminalize the exercise of our personal freedoms, the words put into Washington's mouth were only mildly amusing. Had Washington actually asked such a question, Madison, of all people, would likely have responded, no. This document protects our natural rights at all times and under all circumstances. I could not agree more.
God, so just hearing that is so comforting.
Yes. Yes. Well, it's the fundamental structure of our daily lives, the underpinning of that life. It's the
foundation.
It's an understanding.
It makes me feel like there's ground beneath my feet.
Yes. Yes. And right. And the thing is, the next piece that they're going to have with this is they're going to be saying, well, anything that you mention that is against our program on the corona thing is going to be taken as, an anti-government approach, and we're going to have to silence your ability to have free speech. That's where they're moving with this. That's why they have, what is that term that they have? COVID idiot? It's if you question it, this is it.
And so, idiot.
Yes. Mm-hmm. But remember, Gurdjieff said that we're all idiots. And they're the biggest idiots, therefore. It is easy 233 years later to offer that hypothetical response, particularly since the Supreme Court has done so already, when, as the readers of this column will recall, Abraham Lincoln suspended the constitutionally guaranteed writ of habeas corpus, the right to be brought before a judge upon arrest, only to be rebuked by the Supreme Court. The famous line above by Benjamin Franklin, though uttered in a 1755 dispute between the Pennsylvania legislature and the state's governor over taxes, nevertheless provokes a truism, namely that since our rights come from our humanity, not from the government, foolish people can only sacrifice their own freedoms, not the freedoms of others. Thus, freedom can only be taken away when the government proves fault at a jury trial. This protection is also called procedural due process, and it too is guaranteed in the Constitution. Of what value is a constitutional guarantee if it can be violated when people get sick? Inevitable. Mm-hmm. Question, if it can, it is not a guarantee, it's a fraud. Stated differently, a constitutional guarantee is only as valuable and reliable as is the fidelity of the Constitution of those in whose hands we have reposed it for safekeeping. Because the folks in government, with very few exceptions, suffer from what St. Augustine called libido dominandi, the lust to dominate, when they are confronted with the age-old clash of personal liberty versus government force, they will always, nearly always, come down on the side of force. How do they get away with this? By scaring the daylights out of us. Corona fear exploded beyond all proportion. Quote, back to the article, I never thought I'd see this in my lifetime, though our ancestors saw this in every generation. In America today, we have a government of fear. Machiavelli offered that men obey better when they fear you than when they love you. Sadly, he was right, and the government in America knows this. But Madison knew this as well when he wrote the Constitution, and he knew it 4 years later when he wrote the Bill of Rights. He intentionally employed language to warn those who lust to dominate that however they employ government powers, the Constitution is, quote, the supreme law of the land, unquote. Throws out COG, it throws out emergency powers. The Constitution's the supreme law of the land. They have to abide by it. We have to abide by it. That is our basic bargain with government as citizens. And all government behavior in America is subject to it. The article goes on, but you can see that quite a, he really encapsulates what we've been talking about tonight. So the question is, Miss Olivia, you got 2 questions left.
Well, will you follow up on Sweden a little bit and how they've approached this?
Well, they have taken the course of action that they're not going to install any draconian measures. And of course, they're getting all kinds of guff from their European neighbors, who are going along with this. But it's going to be very interesting to watch them and see how they do with it, because as far as I can tell, they're doing fantastic with it. And
so anybody who felt ill was asked to stay home.
Yes.
And everybody else goes about their business.
Yes.
How brilliant. Schools are open.
And it's interesting, too, because a number of doctors out of Europe have been saying, when they're looking at these different things, one of the worst things that you're doing in driving all these people into these hospital situations is you're exposing them to all the actual patients who have the COVID virus. It's very interesting to look at people who are outside of the op in the medical profession. And people who are stuck in it, I'm not saying that they're responsible for it either. Their healthcare workers are under a system. But because they've been moved into this, I can't tell you how many medical professionals have been in touch with me in high and low positions, and that things I've read, who have told me that there are a number of deaths that happened in relation to their hospital that got changed to say corona when they weren't. There's a number of newspaper articles out there of people complaining, saying, my parent didn't die of corona. They had heart trouble. We knew they were dying. Why are you classifying them in this article and showing them that way? Hundreds of examples.
This is falsification of death certificates.
It is. And it's a process to inflate the crisis, which is bad enough, to make it, so bad that they can do all these other things with it. That's a really major danger. And the media's complicity in that, we've already seen a number of their stories directly from the New York Times fall apart. The one including Dr. Colleen O'Brien, and it didn't make anyone feel good that she was involved in all these simulations for pandemics. These are problematic. When they had 60 Minutes go in there and talk to people at this hospital in New York, they couldn't shoot any footage of their own. All the footage had to be shot by people who were employed at the hospital. Now, look, it's hard enough to be working in a hospital than to have all these forces ranging outside,
Are you talking about Colleen Smith?
Yeah, Dr. Colleen Smith.
Mm-hmm.
And, but in the 60 Minutes piece, when this guy was interviewing these different doctors, the footage that they were getting was shot by people in the hospital. That's fundamentally, I can tell you, having been around the media long enough, you do not let the place that you're investigating provide you with the edited coverage of what they want you to see. It's a fundamental violation of any kind of journalistic protocol. You wouldn't do it. 60 Minutes is using that. That could be footage from a simulation. So,
and they could get sued.
Now, here's the thing. No, they can't get sued, because if they're saying that the hospital is giving them the footage, they'll just say, well, they gave us the footage, and, but fundamentally, no, as a journalist, it's a good point. Ordinarily, they should be able to. But as a journalist, you can't do that. It's a fundamental breach. You are allowing yourself to be part of an advertorial, which is, here's how we want you to see it. Take our footage. Can you imagine somebody investigating like a meat packing plant for violations and them saying, no, everything's okay. Here's this videotape we shot ourselves and you'll be fine. But I'm not saying that to diminish any of the efforts on legitimate healthcare workers working with this. We know that there's a number of them working under these circumstances, but you still have to deal with facts on the ground. And when 60 Minutes does something like that, it means they're trying to put something over because they're violating their own codes. And they always have the excuse, well, we didn't want to catch coronavirus. I'm sure they could put you in one of those germ-free suits and you could walk around with a camera and get your own footage. So who's zooming who. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're here at the end of X Series 84. We're going to take a couple of quick questions before we vanish for tonight, and we'll be back. We're going to be doing some very special shows coming up. I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for a newsletter. This is the perfect time to do it because we're in the situation where they could be knocked off social media at any time. And I guess with the kind of work we do, that's always out there. So it's much better to have that direct pipeline with us. And you'll get the newsletter about once a week on Fridays, letting you know what shows we have in store for you while you're there. Subscribe to the show and back up our efforts for everything that we're trying to do to bring you the facts on the ground. And boy, I have to tell you, I do feel that a lot of people are stepping up and doing some excellent work right now, including Professor Scott and Dr. Farrell and Secretary Fitz. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Okay, so everybody is asking about the grand solar minimum and a real dark winter coming soon.
Wow. Gets. There are aspects of asteroids that, and the pole shift,
super flares, CMEs.
Yeah, and also the fact that these groups may have knowledge of these things and may be using this as some kind of a dry run for how to do it without telling us. I think it has to be acknowledged that we live in an era which, groups have tremendous advantages of knowing these things beyond anything that we know. And so they could be acting, they could be sort of running for the hills legitimately, expecting an incredible EMP or an asteroid to hit. But we live in an era, too, that was prophesied in ancient times as having, even if you look actually to more modern times, like the Casey readings, he talked about a large-scale Earth changes and the types of Earth changes of lands sinking and lands rising. Let's not forget Atlantis rising. In the Caribbean and in the hot zone. So we're in that era. We have to acknowledge that we're in this period of time. And so everything is not as it seems. For sure, this is not all over a virus, for sure. So we need to look outside of that bubble to see what it actually means. And so that's one way to go on it. And I think we will do a show just dedicated to that. We've been so deep on this political process in the past few shows because of everything that's been rolling out. But trust me, I've been keeping an eye on the other stuff too. Yes.
Last question?
Sure.
Okay. So, Shashakila, do you think, as Dr. Farrell alludes, that this is a beta test or the real deal now?
Well, Farrell studies it deeply and has a feel for things and the data mining that they're doing on financial, technical, political, geopolitical levels. And the fact that he feels that it's part of an exercise, a data mining exercise, and more, a whole entire reset of the world's financial system. I would say that, his insights have been guiding us for a long time. He has such a great track record on that we have to consider that as a major, major possibility. And I've always said that, Joseph and Catherine Fitz have the ability to be out there and really ahead, even by years sometimes, with their insights on what's to come to pass. Not that they're prophets or they're trying to predict things. It's just that they're able to watch trends and interpret them, Catherine, from a very well-steeped financial mind, and Joseph really from that incredible knowledge of the function of history. So when either of them talk, it's like E.F. Hutton in the 80s commercial, when any of them talk, I think we have to listen. And with that, I will say we had an outrageously great crowd tonight. Amazing
Insanely
questions.
huge crowd. Hard to keep up with.
And Olivia, bravo. Round of
you.
applause. You did a great job with it.
We had some amazing super chat donations tonight.
Fantastic.
So I have to thank some people.
Yes.
Okay, so I've got Flood, Mindy Drake, Eddie Lamar, a cult fan, Carol Crumlish, Mike D, Crystal Quark, Bill Gomez, Wayne Peak, Joe Spindler, Scabtree Scabby, Aether was incredibly generous. Eurythmy is Fun, Evan Ward, and Philip Gillenwater. Thank you so much.
Incredible. Wow.
And I want to let everybody know I could not copy and paste the questions fast enough. So we're going to go through this chat thoroughly for
a lot of questions.
For a lot of questions and ideas for follow-up shows.
We may do just a show on Q&A as well to
it's
catch
probably
up with
a good
that.
idea.
Thank you so much for your support of the show. It helps a lot for us to be able to spend the time and energy doing it. So it's terrific, and we really appreciate the support. We'll be coming back to you definitely next Friday, possibly in between with breaking news and very special guests that we're in touch with right now. So stay safe out there, and I'm sure we'll all get through being aware. And even if things do show up like Blackout or whatever, I don't believe in the 3 days of darkness or any of the junk from the Q spectrum or any of that. I don't think any of that is happening. What I feel is happening is something that we can get our hands on, and that we do have some verifiable facts for. And, we try to lay out a lot of that tonight. I do feel that the COG aspect is creeping in, and if we can get our eyes on that instead of the hubbub just around the virus, I think we'll have a better shot of dealing with it.
Yeah, and I think everybody is filled with a lot of righteous indignation and anger. And, whatever we can, anger is an energy, right? To quote Johnny Rotten. And that needs to be used. We can flip that and into feeling really love for our country, love for freedom, and for our families and generations to come, and use that energy to plan what we're going to do, because we probably will have this little brief moment in the summer where this will die down, they let us out again, and then it's going to come back in the fall. And we need to be ready. We need to be strategic and not just party all summer long like it's 1999, right? We have to put something in place, some actions that are
listen, I'm going to Miami for the hot soda guys. No, it's a good point. Actually, it's an excellent point. And I would say that maybe that idea of really using the time when things start to open up.
Maybe we can hire Judge Napolitano. I'm serious. People have been talking in the ideas room tonight about suing. That's why I was,
yes. Well,
that redress of grievances that we're talking about.
We'll definitely look into that. And we do have a channel to the judge. And I would like to get in a conversation with him on this. But absolutely fascinating. And I agree with you, by the way. Everything that you said there is a great way to put it. I'm going to do a quick shout out to a few people out here because it's great to see you all. Flood, thank you. Appreciate it. Mr. Wonderful, that's a great name. Lee Veltman, he's out there, the man, the myth. Thomas Karnacki, Johan Wolf. I know we had Gigi Young out there. Thank you, Gigi.
Thank God for Gigi.
Running it down, and you've been doing great shows lately. Gigi's been doing live shows that are just phenomenal. So everyone has to check that out.
The energy in her chats is amazing.
And we had
very different from ours.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's so interesting the way that she's been putting things together. And we also had Carly out there earlier from Dimensions and Beyond doing an incredible job. Modwiz, the man, he's out there. Ross Story, Shamanus, Anam Kara. Excellent questions. Thank you. It's great to see you out there. James Clements, thank you. Kate, it's great to see you out there. Q-Tard Psyop. That's a great name. Oh, yeah. Sometimes the chat is going pretty fast. Wayne Peak, Guitar Dave. Thank you very much. Najat, Johan, a cult fan. super to see you all out there. We will see you all next week, probably before, spoiler alert, and have a great night, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Nice job, Miss Olivia.
I'm starving. It's so late.
Well, that all-night restaurant is right down the street.
Exactly.
Except it's imaginary because everywhere is closed. But I will say this, that there are some really good takeout options that are still available. So no reason to pity us up here. Thanks so much, everyone. And I'm going to end the broadcast, but it never really ends. Like that, never. That's kind of like, get. Good night.